Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
"This is amazing," said Miguel, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the verdant landscape of Elijah's Grove. They had only just arrived, having been teleported thousands of miles in an instant via Elijah's roots of the World Tree spell. But neither Carmen nor Miguel had any means of knowing just how vast the distance between his most recent dolmen, the Circle of Spears, and his grove really was. By comparison, Elijah knew precisely how far they'd come. After all, he'd spent the better part of 2 years trekking across the wilderness, albeit with a few distractions along the way, in an effort to reunite with his sister. However, when he'd finally found his nephew and sister-in-law, he'd been horrified to learn that Alyssa had been killed long ago. Perhaps it had happened before he'd even left his island. Whatever the case, that discovery had come with a healthy dose of rage, guilt, and grief. The first came because his sister hadn't been slain by happenstance. No monster, at least not of the normal variety, had killed her. Instead, she had been murdered by a power-mad despot she'd once considered a friend. That betrayal was foremost in the most prominent facet of Elijah's quartz mind, though he couldn't allow himself to embark on his planned quest for vengeance. Not yet, at least. He needed to get his family and the other refugees who'd come to the grove almost a week before settled. After that, he would give himself fully to revenge. The second emotion, guilt, was twofold. Most prominently, he'd taken his sweet time adjusting to the new world. After Earth had experienced the touch of the World Tree and been transformed, he'd spent months simply surviving. He hadn't been driven by a need to grow stronger. Instead, he'd focused almost entirely on satisfying the necessary requirements to continue living. However, that had all changed after his protector, a powerful Miss Panther Guardian, had been killed, and he'd been forced to see to his own safety. A few months and a life-altering tower run later, and he'd become a different person. Yet, he still wondered what might have happened if he'd taken responsibility for his own progression sooner. Would it have been enough? Maybe not. But the mere possibility that it would have let him find his sister before she was killed haunted him. The same could be said about his habit of giving in to every distraction he found in his travels. Whether it was healing the plague-stricken residents of the first human settlement he'd found, or one of the superfluous tower runs he'd embarked upon, Elijah knew he'd wasted a lot of time. Certainly, he'd also grown more powerful, but he'd trade any number of levels or strangers' lives if he could get just a few more days with his sister. The second facet of that guilt came from before Earth's transformation. Just before Elijah had graduated high school, he'd lost both of his parents. That had sent him down a spiral of grief where he'd pushed everyone away, and it had culminated in his jetting off to Hawaii for college, where he'd studied to become a marine biologist. And while his pursuit of a degree and employment afterwards had been reasonably successful, it had also put thousands of miles, both figuratively as well as literally, between him and the only family he had left. Before, he'd thought he had plenty of time to reconnect, but being diagnosed with terminal cancer had thrown those plans aside. That was how he'd ended up on his island in the first place. Knowing he was dying, Elijah had decided to live his last days with his sister, mostly at her insistence. But the world's transformation and the subsequent crash of his plane had seen him stranded on a deserted island. Loneliness had taught him just how deep his regrets went. Sure, he didn't immediately set off to find his sister and her family, and even when he had, he'd taken his time. From his perspective, there had been no urgency. More, simply finding them when the entire world had been randomized and transformed made the task almost impossible. It was like finding a needle in a haystack, and it was only through coincidence and a little planning that he'd found Carmen and Miguel. Or maybe he was just making excuses. Perhaps his guilt was warranted. Either way, there was nothing he could do to change the past. What he could do, however, was to ensure his family's safety. Carmen and Miguel weren't related to him by blood, but then again, neither was his sprigant friend, Nerthus. That didn't change the fact that all three were family. "I thought you might like it," Elijah said to his nephew. He reached out and gripped the boy's the young man's shoulder. "It wasn't always like this. When I first got here, it was just a big meadow with the ancestral tree in the center. It looked different back then, too." "Different how?" "Well, it was more like a normal tree," Elijah explained. "But when Nerthus absorbed a shard of the world tree, it started to change." "So did he come to that?" "Indeed," said Nerthus, who had a habit of standing so still that one could almost mistake him for a tree himself, albeit an oddly shaped one with only a few leaves. Or perhaps an expertly carved sculpture. However, Nerthus was as distinct an individual as anyone else Elijah had ever met, and he was powerful in his own right. The grove was as much his as it was Elijah's. Perhaps more so, considering how much time and effort the Sprigant had spent guiding its growth. More than that, though, Elijah owed the tree spirit his life. Without him, he'd have never embarked down the path of cultivation, and without those advantages, he had no doubt that he would have long since perished. Most recently, he'd have been slain by one of the most powerful people in the world. Even then, Elijah had been forced to use his entire toolkit to survive Thorgundersson's ambush. "The Ethera here is so dense," Carmen said, almost as impressed as her son. She was a short woman even compared to Elijah, who, in his more honest moments, would have admitted that he was a little below average in the height department, and even though she'd clearly lost weight during her travels, she was still quite muscular. Otherwise, she and Miguel shared the same tan skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. She asked, "How is this possible?" "The ancestral tree is a natural treasure," Nerthus answered. "A powerful one, too. All ancestral trees are strong, influencing their environments more broadly than most treasures. My tree is far more powerful than most, especially after absorbing the shard of the world tree. Making it the center of the grove didn't hurt, either," Elijah supplied. He and Nerthus had spoken on the subject at length, so he knew just how special his situation was. Most natural treasures didn't last long. Even if they were protected by powerful guardians, they were usually consumed by natives or even opportunistic wildlife. Not only had Elijah foregone consuming the tree, he'd also actively reinforced and empowered it. The results had been impressive, growing its influence to encompass the entire island. Indeed, when Elijah had established his grove via one of the first spells his Druid archetype had granted, it had come with a domain, inside of which was a locus of awareness. It had since grown a little past the island's boundaries, so the result was that he could sense everything about the island, regardless of his own location. Fortunately, he had his quartz mind to deal with the overwhelming amount of information. "Do you guys want a tour?" Elijah asked. Miguel eagerly said that he did, while Carmen's agreement was a little more subdued. So, after they gathered the other three who'd preceded them a week before they'd been holed up in the treehouse intended to become Carmen's living quarters since they'd arrived, Elijah set out to show them the highlights of his island. Fittingly, the first location was the grove itself. It was the beating heart of Elijah's domain, and it was easily the most important part of the island. Everyone was suitably impressed by the varied vegetation and the stand of coffee trees Elijah had most recently planted. Nerthus had also planted a wide variety of other plants, from herbs to sunflowers and everything in between. "Glad to see the seeds I got for you didn't go to waste," Elijah said. "Amazing work, Nerthus. Really? You've outdone yourself." The Sprigant beamed at the compliment. It was in moments like that Elijah remembered that, though Nerthus looked like a weathered collection of twisted roots, he was in fact little more than an adolescent. Even since their first meeting, Nerthus' personality had developed considerably, and Elijah expected that trend to continue going forward. After the grove, Elijah took the group to the ruined cabin that had provided solace and protection from the elements for the first few months after the world had transformed. Then, he took the group to the beach, where he introduced them to the giant crabs that seemed to love his island so much. They didn't get close enough to get the huge crustaceans' attention, but Elijah did describe his first few encounters with the creatures. "I woke up to them nibbling on my legs," he said. They weren't bigger than a cocker spaniel back then, but they grew to this size within a year. Thank God they leveled off. Otherwise, we might be in danger of living in a world ravaged by huge crabs, he joked. Once they were suitably impressed by the crabs, Elijah showed off his dwindling collection of rowboats, then pointed out Ironshore across the strait. That's where most of you are going, he said. The people there are mostly okay. Goblins, dwarves, and gnomes. Oh, and a couple of elves. But they're nice enough, now that, well, Ramek keeps them in line. He'd almost let loose with the tale of how he'd slaughtered 50 Ironshore residents who'd attempted to invade his island, but it didn't take a genius to guess that that wouldn't have ended well. Carmen, Miguel, and Colt would be fine. But the other two? They were clearly terrified of him, and he wanted to avoid spooking them any further. Besides, they'd find out the truth soon enough anyway. But by then, they'd be on the other side of the strait where he wouldn't have to deal with it. The final landmark he wanted to show them was the tower, which took a couple of hours to reach. It would have taken longer, but Elijah knew the optimal path. And the others aside from Miguel all had a few levels under their belts. For his part, the young man didn't complain. Instead, he endeavored to keep pace, and though he couldn't do so, he kept up a lot better than Elijah would have predicted. It was impressive, and it boded well for when the young man gained access to the system, and actually started gaining attribute points. Wow, Carmen said. I've never actually seen a tower. I have, Colt said. I was with the second group who went through the one near Easton. It was not a pleasant experience. They usually aren't, Elijah said. But if you want to get stronger, Ironshore sends a group through there once a week. I'm sure they'll let you in. They have a shortage of combatants. I may just do that, Colt stated. When can I do it? Asked Miguel. Not until you have a class, Carmen said. And if I hear about you going anywhere close to that tower. I know, Mom. I'm not stupid, he complained. Carmen just shook her head. After that, Elijah led the others back to the grove. By that point, it was time for supper, so he shared a bit of meat he had stored in his ghoulhide satchel, which they cooked in his kitchen. However, retrieving it highlighted the fact that Elijah had picked up a lot of stuff recently. So he knew he would need to stop by Atticus' shop soon, not only to identify the items, but also to unload anything he didn't need. After the meal, everyone but Carmen headed to the other treehouse. Once they were gone, Elijah and his sister-in-law sat on his balcony, which overlooked the grove. Both clutched steaming mugs full of the tea he'd bought back in Ironshore, and for the longest time, neither spoke. Finally, though, Carmen said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For this. It's exactly what we need," she said. "When you told me about this place, I thought you were exaggerating. But now, I think you might have been underselling it. It's paradise. It wasn't always like this. My first year was incredibly difficult." "I don't doubt it." They both went silent for a little while longer until, once again, Carmen broke the silence and asked, "What are you going to do?" Elijah didn't need her to elaborate. He knew what she was asking. "I've got some things I need to take care of," he said. "Then, I'm going to Easton. I intend to kill him. That's certain. Other than that, I don't know. I still haven't decided." For a moment, Elijah thought his sister-in-law was going to argue. But then, she just gave him a curt nod and said, "Good. If anyone in this world deserves the worst you can dish out, it's Roman Cain." The next morning, Elijah awoke feeling refreshed, and it actually took him a few moments to remember the burden of vengeance he'd taken upon himself. The moment he settled into those thoughts, his mood darkened, but he forced the roiling emotions into their own facet, where he could ignore them at least long enough to do what needed to be done. Because as much as he wanted to simply rush off to Easton, he knew he had a lot to accomplish before he could do so without worry. For one, he needed to finish getting Carmen and the others settled, and that meant introducing them to Ironshore. Then, he had a few other minor tasks to accomplish before he could, in good conscience, fully embrace his new mission. And one larger task, though that would have to wait until after a visit to Ironshore. To that end, he pushed himself out of bed, then took care of his business in the bathroom before taking a long, hot shower. To his delight, Nerthus had adjusted both the water pressure as well as the temperature, so even with his high constitution, Elijah could feel the change. In the days before Earth's transformation, it might have felt like he was being pressure-washed by near-boiling water, but now it was soothing. So Elijah took a little longer than absolutely necessary before he stepped out of the shower and dressed. After that, he completely emptied his satchel, placing everything in separate piles, depending on their type. Magical items went in one section, while leftover meat went into another. The few berries he had left found their way into another section, while his clothing, which was universally soiled, was in another pile. There were bits and pieces of animal hide, a few teeth, and some wooden trinkets he'd carved during his downtime. It was shocking how much would fit into the ghoul hide satchel, and looking at his accumulated possessions, Elijah had no choice but to come to one simple conclusion: he'd become a bit of a pack rat. With that in mind, he set upon the items, earmarking much of it for disposal. He didn't need a half-dozen poorly preserved rabbit furs, after all. Nor did he need a collection of snake fangs. The same could be said for Thor's clothing, which Elijah had looted. The cloth was nothing special, and it was all sized to fit a giant. Besides, it was all blood-stained and had been ripped to pieces by the battle. So it went into the heap of items meant to be discarded. The man's armor was a different story. It was mundane. Not even crude grade. And Elijah questioned why such a powerful fighter had bothered wearing armor that was, by every metric Elijah could use, inferior to the man's bare skin. Perhaps it was meant to assuage the Thor's vanity. After all, he'd seemed to have chosen his attire to portray a specific aesthetic. Or maybe it had held sentimental value, though from what he knew of the former high-ranker, that didn't seem likely. Either way, Elijah wasn't in the habit of discarding good metal or cured leather. So he kept that. As for the magical items, there were a few that had yet to be identified. Like the fanged necklace. Or even Elijah's new staff. He suspected that it would help his shape-shifting in some way, but he couldn't be certain of anything until he had Atticus identify it. The ghoul hide satchel's functions were easier to discern, but Elijah wanted to get it appraised as well. The same was true of his weighted gloves. The canteen, too. Finally, the meat went into his cold storage. It would keep for a while in there, and though Elijah knew he wouldn't remain on the island long, he intended to leave it there for Carmen and Miguel. They couldn't hunt as easily as he could, so that seemed the most prudent course of action. The pile of clothes as well as his cloak of the Iron Bear got a generous dusting of cleansing powder. It would take a couple of hours for that to work, so he donned his lone clean pair of pants before heading out to the grove to refamiliarize himself with everything. He could, of course, sense the entire island right down to the tiniest insect, but there was something about actually laying eyes on the flora that made all the difference. For a while, he just walked among the bushes and flowers, delighting in the aromas as well as the fat honeybees buzzing about. Thankfully, those insects hadn't been changed by the touch of the world tree. Upon finding his patch of lavender, he picked some so that he could get another batch of infused oil going. And of course, as he walked through the grove, he didn't hesitate to grab a couple of berries here and there. But eventually, his path took him to his coffee trees. Each one had reached almost 20 feet in height, which was abnormally large for that species. However, Elijah chalked that increased size up to the presence of Ethera that had grown so many other things out of proportion. The cherries were still green, which meant that they weren't yet ripe. But he could sense that it wouldn't be long before they were ready to be plucked. Then, he'd have all the coffee he could drink. And hopefully, it would have some special effects, just like his berries. He was inspecting his trees when Carmen approached. He'd felt her awaken nearly 45 minutes before, but he'd pointedly not paid much attention to the facet of his mind that was dedicated to monitoring his domain. Everyone deserved at least a little privacy, after all. "Sleep well?" he asked, resting his hand on one of the tree's branches. He held out his other hand, asking, "Berry?" "I did." That moss bed was probably the most comfortable place I've ever slept, she admitted, taking one of the berries. She let out an audible sigh upon popping it into her mouth. Why does every one of these taste different? I don't know, Elijah admitted. Ethera is weird. You can say that again. Are these coffee trees? Yeah, Elijah answered, finally looking back at her with a grin. He almost felt it too, but he knew he was forcing it. Perhaps the day would come when every thought wasn't accompanied by pangs of loss, but for now, he would just have to fake emotions other than grief or anger. To distract himself, Elijah explained how he'd gotten the miracle seed. And after that, Nerthus helped me turn one tree into a whole grove. Though when I made my calculations, I only made enough for personal use. I guess I'm lucky they're a lot bigger than I expected. What are we planning for today? She asked. Well, I'm about to train a little, Elijah said. About an hour or so. By the time I'm done, everyone over in Ironshore should be awake. So we're going over there so I can get your friends settled. You and Miguel are welcome to live here on the island, but I don't want the others here. Then, his hand found the back of his neck and he added, if you want to live here, I mean. Totally get it if you don't want to, what with my localized omnipotence. Well, omniscience at least. What? I'm not all-powerful, but I am all-knowing. I know what the two words mean, Elijah. What are you talking about? She asked, annoyed. Well, I kind of know everything that happens here on the island. Everything. 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 That's disturbing, she said. Try living with it. Not that I'm complaining, mind you, but if I didn't have a quartz mind, I'd have already gone nuts, I'm sure. But Opal kind of kept it in check too, so who knows? It would be silly not to live here. For Miguel, at least the increased Ethera density has to be beneficial, she said. And I'd love to know more about cultivation. I haven't stepped on that path yet, but I'm beginning to think that I need to remedy that. I don't intend to fight, but I'm certain that it will help me with smithing. Oh yeah. Speaking of that, the town over there across the strait. They have a mine where they've found some sort of special metal, Elijah said. I don't remember what it was called, but Carissa, she's the dwarf in charge, seemed really excited about it. So did Ramek, come to think of it. After that, Carmen seemed a lot more excited about visiting Ironshore. However, Elijah meant to keep to his plan, not least because he didn't want to barge in on Ramek before the goblin even had a chance to properly wake up. So, after extricating himself from Carmen's interrogation on magical ores, he retreated to the beach, where he restarted the training routine he followed each time he was home. And he was more than a little surprised to find that everything was quite a bit easier than it had ever been. To make things more productive, he found a couple of huge rocks to carry around while he swam, ran, and did various acrobatics. Still, it was only marginally taxing, at least until he went through his yoga routine in his lamellar ape form. That was still just as challenging as ever. About halfway through, he felt Colt approach. The slim swordsman asked if he wanted to spar a bit, and Elijah consented. That's when he discovered just how lacking his staff fighting technique was. Even though he knew he should have had a host of advantages on his side regarding attributes, cultivation, and the general superiority of his chosen weapon, he found himself being soundly beaten by the one-armed man. Of course, in a real fight, Elijah would have simply switched to one of his bestial forms and ripped Colt to shreds. But that wasn't the point, and it drove home the notion that he needed quite a lot of practice before he could ever consider himself competent with his staff. Fortunately, Colt was willing to give him plenty of pointers, so Elijah felt that he made decent progress, even though their practice session only lasted for an hour. After that, he resolved to continue training with the men for as long as he remained on the island. Part of that was simple necessity. He couldn't afford to be so vulnerable in his caster form, and his fight with Thor had hammered that into him. In that battle, Elijah could only retreat and hope to delay the men long enough to pounce on any weakness. Hopefully, with enough practice, he could fix that deficiency, because if Colt had proven anything, it was that attributes weren't everything. Technique counted for quite a lot. Elijah would have been lying to himself if he didn't admit that his competitive spirit was responsible for the rest of that resolution. He'd never taken losing well. Usually, his response was to train harder, and this situation was no different. After that, the pair returned to the grove, where they found everyone else up and about. The spares, as Elijah referred to Teresa, and Byron remained in the treehouse, obviously afraid to offend him by venturing out of bounds. Elijah hadn't gone out of his way to disabuse them of that notion, largely because he wasn't comfortable with strangers wandering around his island. In any case, he returned to his own treehouse, took a blisteringly quick shower, then dressed in his now clean clothes. He was certain to don his normal magical kit as well. That included his 2 rings, the ring of aquatic travel that would let him breathe underwater, and the often useless ring of anonymity that would give the ability to disguise his identity. Next came his weighted gloves, which he willed to disappear a moment after slipping them onto his hands. After that, he tied his sash of the whirlwind in place before wrapping the silver bracer of rage around his forearm. Finally, he slipped the ghoul-hide satchel on, settled the cloak of the Iron Bear over his shoulders, fastened it in place with the silver toggles, then took up his dragon-touched staff. Thus equipped, he descended from his treehouse and joined the others before leading them to his collection of rowboats. It was then that he remembered just how much he hated rowing across the strait. At first, he was tempted to simply shift into the shape of the sky and fly across, but that could very well cause issues with his neighbors. On top of that, it wouldn't really save any time because Kamen and the others would still have to paddle across. So it was with some regret that, after everyone was on board, he shoved the rowboat into the water, leaped aboard, and began the arduous task of rowing everyone across. Of course, some of the others, including the one-armed colt, offered to help, but he insisted he was fine with it. He even said he enjoyed it, for some indefinable reason. Regardless, he guided the small boat across the strait with ease, and only 20 minutes later, they arrived at the dock. Of course, suspicious glances from the residents of Ironshore soon found them. Elijah was used to that, though. So he wasted no time in tying the boat off and helping everyone on shore. After that, they headed to Ramek's office. For his part, the dapper goblin mayor was happy to see Elijah, and he was eager to share that they'd established trade relations with Norcastle on the other side of the mountain range. "That's awesome," Elijah said, forcing a smile. He hadn't even remembered that they were trying to liaise with the human city, but he was glad of any success Ironshore could find. He had long suspected that their fate would be tied to his, after all. As they rose, so too would he. Especially since humans were integrating into the town. "There are only a few so far, but we expect more to come from Norcastle," Ramek said proudly. "We're growing, Elijah. In a few years, we may even turn a profit." Soon after, Elijah had made arrangements for Teresa and Byron to stay in the city. Both had a few levels under their belts, and Ramek seemed thrilled by their classes. Next, Elijah took Carmen to see the mine foreman, Carissa. The dwarven woman was even happier to meet Carmen after discovering she was a blacksmith than Ramek had been about the pair of scholars, and before long, the dwarf and his sister-in-law had forgotten he was even there. So Elijah, Colt, and Miguel went to the Stuck Pig, where they enjoyed a nice meal. It was a bit early for lunch, but it only took a whiff of the succulent smells of roasting meat to get the other two on board. After that, Elijah ran some errands buying some supplies for soap making, more cleansing powder, and rations before finally going back to fetch Carmen. She had somehow found an anvil, and was deep into a demonstration for Carissa. "I'll return to the island once I'm done," Carmen said. "You go ahead." "It's getting dark soon," Elijah responded. "Then I'll stay the night here." "I'm sure Carissa can find a place for me to bunk," Carmen stated dismissively. After the dwarven foreman eagerly agreed to that, the pair practically pushed Elijah out of the mining office. "It wasn't so long ago that I was sneaking through town and murdering ritualists," he mused. "What was that, Haas?" asked Colt. "Huh? Something about murderin' ritualists." "Nothing. I'm sure you misheard." "Let's go," Elijah said, already walking toward the dock. Normally, Elijah enjoyed the sound of birds chirping in the morning. However, after a night of heavy drinking until he blacked out, he found the cacophony to be the height of annoyance. For a long time, he just lay there, reveling in his own misery until he finally pushed himself upright and cast Soothe. It helped, though it took almost the entire runtime of the spell before his headache faded and his stomach stopped roiling. He almost regretted it. After all, he'd consumed nearly 5 gallons of the potent liquor he'd gotten back in Velosta. He should have spent the entire day paying for his excess. Without those consequences hanging over his head, Elijah knew how easy it would be to turn back to the bottle. He'd never been one to try to drown his sorrows, but then again, he'd never lost a sister either. And now that he didn't have the Dolmen's construction, or getting everyone settled to distract him, he could give himself fully to the grief. And the anger. That was there too, inescapable and inexorable. Swinging his legs off the bed, Elijah bent over, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at the floor. At least drinking the night away had given him some reprieve. But he knew he couldn't do that every time. He didn't want to deal with his emotions. Not only was it unhealthy, but it was also more expensive than he could manage. Alcohol wasn't cheap in Ironshore, and his free supply was now gone. Perhaps he could learn to ferment his berries into wine. Shaking his head, Elijah ran his hand through his hair and let out a long sigh. Alyssa wouldn't have approved of any of it. She would have scolded him like she had when he'd gone down a similar route right after their parents had died. She was right, too. Elijah was an adult now. Not only did he have responsibilities, but he also had goals. More importantly, Miguel had begun to look up to him. It hadn't been long since they'd been reunited, but the young man clearly craved examples to emulate. He had Colt, and that was great. From what Elijah could tell, Miguel couldn't have picked a better man to model himself after. But he'd latched onto Elijah as well, which came with a responsibility to put his own self-pity aside and be there for the young man. They all had to do that. Carmen had managed it, and so could Elijah. With that in mind, he climbed to his feet with another sigh, but the next intake of breath nearly made him gag. Drinking himself into a stupor was messy work, and the smell of his strenuous labor hung off him like a cloak. That cemented Elijah's first order of business, and he wasted no more time before taking a shower. His homemade soap made a world of difference, picking up the slack where his spell had left off, and when he exited the bathroom, he felt like a new man. However, he couldn't escape the reality of the night's excesses, so he spent a little time gathering bottles and cleaning the bedding. Finally, a little more than half an hour later, he was ready to start his day. Like always when he was home, he spent the next couple of hours training, though he wasn't afforded the opportunity of another sparring session with Colt. That wasn't to say that the other man wasn't training on his own. He was, and Miguel was with him, but they were doing their own thing, practicing sword katas in the grove. So Elijah focused on his own routine, and after the previous day's efforts, he managed to alter his regimen to push even his massive attributes to their limits. Around 3 hours after he'd begun, he felt a rowboat enter his domain, and a second later, he recognized that Carmen had finally returned. He left her to her own devices for another hour, and in that time, she arrived back at the grove, where she watched her son's training. Elijah found her sitting on the roots of one of the trees that comprised the outer ring of his grove, and he joined her. The first few minutes they simply watched, but then, Elijah asked, "Did you have a productive introduction to Ironshore?" "I did," she said. "You know they don't have a proper blacksmith. They have some people with classes specializing in processing, or making alloys, and such, but no one to work with the final product. I'm guessing you're going to fill that role." She nodded. "I'm building my own smithy," Carmen answered. "A proper forge, like I had back in Silverado." Elijah winced. "That name." "I know," she said with a wry smile. "I didn't name it, though. Do you know what happened to it?" She shook her head, saying, "I don't know. I'm sure Roman wouldn't have abandoned it. That cold iron is too useful. Though they don't have any smiths worth a damn now. Not unless someone stepped up, and I know everyone who might have." They're all average at best. Lazy, unmotivated, and untalented at worst. Ouch. Tell me how you really feel. Carmen shrugged. You don't know how it is in a city like that, she responded. By and large, people aren't really built to excel. They do what they have to do to get what they want. Most of the time, that means survival with a few conveniences. Some distractions. And for a crafter in Easton, the bar is incredibly low. You can get pretty rich just making run-of-the-mill equipment. The incentive to push higher just isn't there, except for personal motivation. They think they're safe. They believe the danger has passed. It hasn't, Elijah said. There are more than towers out there. He'd read a couple of guides about the progression of dimensional rifts. The most common expression of those anomalies was spontaneous manifestation. A powerful vox would simply tear through the membrane between universes and enter one of the planets connected to the world tree. In a lot of ways, these were the most dangerous, because they could be far more powerful than the vox attached to dimensional rifts and towers. Above those were primal realms, which, as Elijah understood them, were like towers on steroids. They were bigger, more complex, and far deadlier than towers. As a result, they could accommodate up to 20 people, as opposed to the comparatively smaller groups that could challenge a tower. But even more troubling, those primal realms could exert influence on the world, transforming the terrain to fit their theme. The guide he'd read used a magmatic cave as an example, explaining that in such a scenario, the land surrounding the primal realm would take on the fiery traits of the realm. But there were bigger threats out there, too. Ancient realms. Battle worlds. Trial planets. The list went on and on. The fact was that they'd joined an extremely dangerous multiverse, and even if the people of Easton had attained some semblance of safety, that would not remain the case for all eternity. Eventually, they would be threatened, and if they didn't have the strength to stand up to those threats, they would die. Elijah couldn't worry about that, though. Especially considering that he had yet to decide whether or not Easton needed to share its leader's fate. His instincts told him to simply remove the city from the map, but his sense of morality, as sometimes skewed as it was, wouldn't let him do so without significant consideration. I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks, he said. Is it time? No, he answered. I'm not going to Easton yet. I'll be close, but I would rather not be disturbed unless absolutely necessary. What are you doing? Elijah said, I've been working on my soul cultivation for a while. If I don't finalize it now, I'll have to spend a little time each day keeping it fresh. I don't want to be distracted while I do what I need to do in Easton, so I need to push through to the next step. Cultivation. Alyssa had started working on her body before she passed. Ask Nerthus about it if you want some help. He's the one who put me on the right path, Elijah suggested. If he can't help, I could give it a shot. I'll be honest, though most of what I've done probably isn't replicable. I'll ask him. If not for me, then definitely for Miguel. He'll be getting his archetype soon, and I know how powerful cultivation can be. Anything that gives him a better chance of survival, Elijah agreed. I'll help where I can, but after I do what I need to do. After that, Elijah left Carmen to her own devices as he prepared for what he intended. Once he'd left his valuables behind in the treehouse, he set off across the island, and upon reaching the beach, he disrobed and waded into the cold water. Soon enough, he dove beneath the waves and was swimming toward the crevice that would lead him to the cultivation cave. He took his time, slowly making his way as he mentally prepared. He couldn't afford to let extraneous thoughts pollute his mind, so even after he reached the cave, he spent nearly 3 hours forcing himself into the right headspace. He did notice that the Ethera density had risen to unprecedented levels, and the flora had responded in kind. It was a practical jungle of kelp and other sea plants, with plenty of small fish, water bugs, and other marine creatures having arrived to take advantage of the thick energy. If Elijah had to guess, the Ethera in the cave was at least twice as dense as it was in the heart of his grove. The rest of the island was even thinner, though compared to the outside world, it was an ethereal paradise. For cultivation purposes, all of which required extremely dense Ethera, there probably wasn't a better location in the world. Even if there were a few places that could rival it, the world was huge now. After all, Elijah's cave was entirely sustainable. He could use it over and over again, and from what he could tell, it would just keep growing stronger. A good thing, too, because the requirements to reach the next levels of cultivation would assuredly be quite steep. In any case, Elijah swam to the center of the cave, then focused on his task. He didn't start the process yet. Instead, he continued to meditate as he established the right frame of mind. Hours later, he felt he was ready. The first step was to swirl the Ethera in his core, which wasn't particularly difficult. He'd already started cycling the energy in preparation for taking the next step in his core cultivation, so he'd learned the basics of moving Ethera. Still, it took time and the focus of all but a few of his mind facets. Elijah fell into a rhythm, pushing and pulling the Ethera to create a whirlpool of energy that stretched his core to its limits. The pressure continued to build until, at last, he gave it an outlet, guiding the gathered Ethera to a single point that marked the genesis of his first channel, and the system of channels he intended to build. It was like an explosion going off inside his body, and Elijah had to harness every ounce of his willpower just to keep from gasping at the sudden spike of pain. Cultivation, it seemed, required significant pain tolerance. But that single explosion was only the beginning, and over the next few hours, he continued to swirl his Ethera, then focus its pressure toward that same point. And slowly, the channel began to take shape, snaking out from his core, and up his torso, forming the main trunk of the intended pattern. Not coincidentally, the pattern he'd memorized looked very much like a tree. That pattern was a long way off, though. He'd allocated 2 weeks for the process, but after excavating that single channel, he knew it would likely take even longer than his initial estimate. Still, once begun, stopping short of completion was not an option. It was possible to resume the process, but that would affect the result. And Elijah wasn't willing to take anything but the best. So he leveraged his mind as well as his considerable willpower and tolerance for pain to continue on. After the first trunk, he used the same method to carve the branches which would take Ethera throughout his body. The first step of soul cultivation, which he'd taken what felt like a lifetime ago, had decentralized his pathways, but that was only preparation for the second step. One had to break the system down before it could be rebuilt, better and more efficient, and more personally meaningful than ever. Gradually, Elijah forced the channels into being. The trunk was first, then the limbs. And finally, the branches. Later stages would build upon those efforts, creating a more elaborate system, but for now, the rudimentary design was enough. Throughout the process, Elijah was keenly aware of the cost of any potential mistakes. He wouldn't die. Nor would he lose the ability to use Ethera. Rather, the system would simply be less efficient. And given that every subsequent step built off the initial foundation, getting it right was an absolute necessity. Days passed into more than a week, and eventually, he passed the bounds of his estimated time of completion. Yet, on he went, digging the channels through his body. At some point, he stopped processing the pain. He was aware of it, but it was distant. Unimportant. However, he grew ever more exhausted until manipulating his Ethera felt like trying to stir molasses. Even so, he pushed on. And finally, after he'd long since lost track of time, the task was done, a fact that was verified by a flash of Ethera that hardened the walls of each channel. That was expected, but in his state of intense fatigue, Elijah was still startled. Suddenly, all the Ethera in his body dissipated. For a moment, he was drowning in nothingness. Then, the apertures in his mind opened up, and Ethera flooded back in. However, unlike before, it didn't simply diffuse into his body. Rather, it followed the well-defined channels he'd spent so long carving. And it moved so quickly that Elijah had difficulty tracking it. The soul wasn't some ephemeral thing. In a very real way, it connected everything about his ethereal system, and those channels concentrated the Ethera, keeping it under pressure to force it to go much faster than ever before. Elijah let out a watery gasp that sent bubbles toward the cave's air pocket above. Then, he read the notification he'd expected. Congratulations! You have cultivated a novice soul. For a while, he just floated there, satisfied with his progress. Then, he looked down to see that the process had drained the cave of most of its Ethera. Fortunately, the plant life hadn't died, as it had when he'd cultivated his body of stone. That was a relief, at least. But more than anything, Elijah was glad to have taken one of the necessary steps before he could embark on his quest for revenge. The water inside the cave was deathly still, evidence that his actions had driven the sea life away. Likely, it was a defense mechanism meant to ensure that they didn't get caught in the dangerous flows of Ethera. After all, when Elijah had cultivated his body of stone, it had killed everything in the cave. And while death was an inevitable part of life, he didn't relish the notion of killing anything unnecessarily. The trick was deciding when it was needed. Regardless, after floating in the cave for a few more minutes, Elijah turned his attention to his status. Name: Elijah Hart. Level: 76. Archetype: Druid. Class: Animist. Specialization: Not applicable. Alignment: Not applicable. Strength: 87. Dexterity: 79. Constitution: 87. Ethera: 85. Regeneration: 79. Attunement: Nature. Cultivation stage: Cultivator. Body: Core. Mind: Soul. Stone: Hatchling. Quartz: Novice. His attributes hadn't changed since he'd killed Thor, but he could feel the difference in his casting speed. The benefits were more than that, though. Initially, he'd thought the different categories of cultivation coincided with specific benefits. Back then, it had seemed so clear. The stage of his body affected the expression of his physical attributes. It didn't raise his strength, dexterity, constitution, or regeneration. Instead, it made each point count for more. Meanwhile, his mind gave him the ability to regenerate Ethera more quickly with each higher stage. And his soul affected the application speed of that Ethera. The core was the odd one out, and in addition to affecting the potency of his spells, it also changed their flavor. For him, that meant his alternative shapes had taken on draconic characteristics, but for others, it would probably have quite a different effect. In any case, Elijah now saw how nothing was quite as separate as it had once seemed. In fact, it was all intertwined in a way that meant that a step forward in any category would mean an overall benefit. So, when he'd reached the novice soul stage, it had also removed something of a bottleneck for his ability to regenerate Ethera. Before, his mind was capable of pulling in far more energy than he could process. Now, though, his soul could finally keep up. The only piece lagging behind was his core, and he'd already begun to work on that. Thankfully, Elijah didn't have to repopulate the cave this time. However, he did spend most of a day pulsing nature's bounty, and to his surprise, the spell's effective radius had nearly doubled. He could only guess that was his novice soul's effect at play. Once he was assured that the cave's Ethera density would recover, he swam free of the cave, breaking into the ocean sometime later. After that, it only took him a few minutes to reach the shore, where he quickly dressed in the clothes he'd left there weeks before, then headed back to the grove. Carmen wasn't there, which he reasoned was due to her having gone to Ironshore. Idly, Elijah wondered how her forge was coming along, but he had no interest in crossing the strait to find out. She would explain everything when she returned. Neither Miguel nor Colt were on the island either, which felt a bit like old times. Until that moment, he hadn't really acknowledged what a lonely existence he'd led in the wake of washing ashore, but after having his family around for a few days, the lack was extremely noticeable. But at least Nerthus was there. Elijah busied himself by preparing for his coming trip, but there was only so much to do, so he eventually ended up wandering the grove and inspecting all the different flora Nerthus had planted. There were so many varieties, many of which Elijah had never seen before, that he quickly lost count. In addition, there were plenty of mushrooms, hundreds of species of insects and spiders, and quite a few rodents as well. Elijah even felt a few snakes who would inevitably feed on those rats. It was a thriving ecosystem, though a curated one that somehow conveyed a sense of wilderness as well. It was a unique place, and though Elijah often took it for granted, he couldn't have been more appreciative for the wondrous grove. Eventually, he found Nerthus tending to the coffee trees, which had grown even larger in his absence. These were only supposed to grow to around 15 feet tall, he remarked, resting his hand on one of the branches. It was incredibly healthy, with dense veins of Ethera pulsing through it. They've grown almost twice that height, and they're still not entirely mature. I suspect you are correct, said Nerthus. The Sprigant had also grown a bit, too, reaching a height of around 5 feet. It wouldn't be long before he was taller than Elijah. The cherries will ripen soon. I know. I'm very much looking forward to it, Elijah said, already imagining his first cup of coffee. Which reminds me, sugar. What would you like to know about it? Asked the tree spirit. Well, I was wondering if I should try to grow sugar cane, or sugar beets, Elijah said. He knew that the process of making granulated sugar wasn't a complicated one. Generally, the idea was to simply squeeze the liquid out of either source, then heat the product until it crystallized. After that, a centrifuge was used to separate it. However, the problem was that sugar cane generally favored tropical environments, and sugar beets were far less efficient. More, the process was time-consuming as well as wasteful. That's when he considered another alternative. What do you know about apiculture? He asked. Bees? For their honey, Elijah said. He preferred sugar in his coffee, and lots of it. However, he knew for a fact that his island had plenty of bees. It wouldn't take much to create an apiary that could satisfy his sweet tooth. Then, he explained the idea behind it to Nerthus, finishing with, I'm pretty sure the honey will have the same effects of other things grown here, right? I do not know, Nerthus admitted. I can start the project if you wish. Bees are an integral part of any grove. I think that would be best, Elijah said, already imagining enjoying a honey-sweetened cup of coffee. But for now. What? Asked Nerthus when Elijah trailed off. Oh. Nothing. Carmen and Miguel just got back to the island. After that, the pair waited on the others to reach the grove, and when they did, Elijah approached. They exchanged greetings, after which he broke the news, I managed to get to the second stage of soul cultivation. But now, I have a couple of errands I need to run that are going to take me at least a week. You like to stay busy, don't you? Carmen responded. Elijah shrugged. Not usually. I mean, normally I take my time with everything. It took me almost 2 years before I even crossed the strait. But I can't do that now. You know why. Miguel blurted, You're going to kill him. I am, Elijah said. The young man deserved to know the truth. Besides, it would help no one if Elijah shielded him. After everything Miguel had seen, it would be pointless, too. Brutal honesty was the better path. But not yet. I'm going to Argos first. I have a friend there who can identify my excess gear, and if it's not useful, he'll buy it. On top of that, I made a promise to another friend, and I intend to make good on it. He'd almost forgotten to enlist Biggle's help with Constantinos and the sickness affecting his children, but now that he had the ability to teleport to the area, he could see no reason not to get it out of the way. After all, Elijah hadn't forgotten the price he'd already paid for procrastination. Time was not promised, and every passing day meant that those children would run the risk of succumbing to their issues. Can I come? Asked Miguel. Elijah was about to refuse, but then he thought better of it. Argos was the only place he'd found where he felt almost as comfortable as in his own grove. And if Miguel wanted to see it, Elijah wasn't going to turn him down. The only question was whether or not Carmen would allow it. I don't have a problem with that, Elijah said. What about you, Carmen? You want to go? Carmen shook her head. No. I can't. I'm still getting the smithy set up, she said. Then, she revealed how much work had gone into the site. It seemed that Ironshore was just as eager as she was, and they'd fully committed to putting her to work. On top of that, she explained that the other two, Teresa and Byron, had found work as well. The former was working with Biggle, while the latter had gone to work in the mines not as a miner, but rather utilizing his geologist's skills in some way. Elijah didn't probe further. As interesting as he found the myriad classes, he was more concerned with accomplishing his goals. But Miggy can go. Seriously? Elijah and Miguel both said at the same time. She narrowed her eyes. I'm not a helicopter mom, she muttered. Miggy needs to see the world, and not just the parts that are going to try to kill him. Argos sounds like the sort of place he needs to visit. Oh. That makes sense, Elijah said, and it did. Miguel had been through a lot, and it was important for him to see that everything about their new world wasn't terrible. In fact, it was filled with miracles. You make it sound boring, Miguel mumbled under his breath. Elijah heard it just fine, though. Elijah skated right past that, saying, all right, then. We're going back to Ironshore to pick up a friend. Then, we'll go to Argos. So soon? Asked Carmen. Don't you need to prepare? Elijah slapped his ghoul-hide satchel, saying, got everything I need right here. Of course, Carmen had other ideas, reminding him that Miguel didn't have a magical satchel. So, after enduring her chastisement, Elijah set off for Ironshore while Miguel went to pack his clothes. He didn't have much, which was something that would soon need to change. Perhaps he could get Mari to make him a set of clothes, too. In any case, Elijah wasn't going to sit around and wait for Miguel, so he took on the shape of the sky and quickly launched himself high into the air. The trip across the strait was much quicker in that form, and in only around 30 seconds, he thudded down on the path just outside of Biggle's yard. He'd just taken on his human form when the guards arrived, reminding Elijah that he hadn't told anyone in the town about his new form. So he spent the next few minutes assuring the pair of guards that there was no monster around. Everyone in town knew about his ability to shapeshift, so it didn't take that long to convince the two dwarves. By that point, though, Biggle had taken notice of them. What in all the hells is going on out here? Elijah? What are you doing here? The gnome demanded. Get packed. We're going on a trip. What? I'll pay you. You're going to consult with another alchemist about some sick kids, Elijah said. I am. Elijah clapped his hands. Chop chop, mun. I want to be there before nightfall, he said. Where are we going? The bushy-eyebrowed gnome asked. And you mentioned pay. How much? Elijah sighed. Then he explained the situation, ending with, we'll be gone for no more than a week. After that, they negotiated the price of the gnome's assistance. It was far more expensive than Elijah would have preferred, but he had no leverage in the situation. More, he wanted Biggle to just drop everything. So a little extra was warranted, even if Elijah found it slightly irritating. Regardless, it only took Biggle 30 minutes to pack everything he would need, and then, the pair returned to Elijah's island. This time, they took one of the rowboats he'd left behind, much to his chagrin. He'd have much preferred to fly, but he didn't think Biggle would appreciate being carried around in his talons, and Elijah certainly wasn't going to let the gnome ride on his back. In any case, they made decent time crossing the strait, and Elijah beached the rowboat after only 30 minutes. When he noticed Biggle's hesitation to step one foot onto the shore, Elijah let out a sigh. Nothing is going to hurt you so long as you stay on the beach, he said. Perhaps he'd done too good of a job making the island seem dangerous. It was. Immensely so, when he was around. But the look on Biggle's face was one of abject terror. I've heard stories. And they'll tell you that everything was fine until people left the beach, Elijah said. Remember that. He wanted to trust the alchemist, but his grove was a treasure trove to someone with that class. So he had no intention of showing Biggle anything interesting. Besides, he'd already established the rules for the people of Ironshore. They weren't permitted to travel inland. And Elijah wasn't going to change those rules for anyone but his most trusted friends. At present that list only contained one name from Ironshore, Curik. As it turned out, Elijah didn't have to worry about Biggle wandering around. The gnomish alchemist remained in the boat while he went to fetch Miguel. When Elijah arrived in the grove, he found Carmen fussing over her son, drilling him about behaving himself while he was with Uncle Elijah. She also grilled him about things he might have left behind. Finally, Miguel hefted his backpack and said, "I've got everything I need, Mom." "Relax. Don't you dare tell me to relax, Mijo," she said. He held up his hands. Sorry. I didn't mean it." "Well, I did. But you know what I mean." Elijah cut in, saying, "Well, it's about time to hit the dusty trail." Punctuating that, he grabbed Miguel by the upper arm and dragged him away, waving at Carmen as he pulled Miguel from the grove. "We'll be back before you know it. Trust me." Soon enough, they'd progressed through the forest and reached the boat to find Biggle huddled in the corner. "I heard something," he said. Elijah knew good and well that there was nothing to hear, but he just nodded sagely. "That's the guardian spirit. Extremely powerful. Eats gnomes for every meal." "Ah, really?" asked the terrified alchemist. "No. There's nothing there. Besides, we're leaving." Then, Elijah cast Roots of the World Tree. It completed far more quickly than it ever had before, and in only around 15 seconds, the gate of roots and vines had formed. A moment later the interior of the arch shimmered, then solidified into a view of the dragon circle. "After you," Elijah said, gesturing to the gate. To his credit, Miguel didn't hesitate to stride through. Biggle was a lot more circumspect. Though, at Elijah's urging, he went through as well. Then, finally, Elijah did too. Beneath his palm, the first menhir Elijah had created pulsed with power. It was one of 9 that comprised the dolmen that had unlocked so much potential, transforming Ancestral Circle into Roots of the World Tree, giving him the ability to teleport across the world, so long as he'd created a circle to receive him. But it felt different than it had before. Stronger. The ethereal flows that coursed from one menhir to the next hadn't been nearly as obvious before, but now, Elijah felt that he could practically see the web of Ethera connecting the entire thing. And in the center of that circle was a level of power Elijah hadn't seen anywhere but his grove. There was something beneath it, too. Something he couldn't even begin to understand. Had the flows grown stronger? Or was Elijah simply more attuned to the Ethera, now that he'd reached the second stage of soul cultivation? He had no idea, though the guide he'd bought had suggested that progression through the stages of cultivation often came with increased perception. At the time, he'd thought that it only meant that his senses would grow sharper. That had been the case so far, with his visual acuity and hearing having progressed far past human norms, especially in his bestial shapes. Yet, he suspected that there was far more to it than that. Perhaps one day he would be able to sense Ethera as clearly as he could see the leaves on a tree. There were scholars who specialized in studying Ethera, after all. So such a thing was almost assuredly possible. He just wasn't certain if he would ever reach that point. "This is incredible," muttered Biggle, his mouth agape. "How far have we come? Who built this? Is it some relic of the past? I've heard about transportation networks before, but this is different than any stories I have heard." "Transportation networks?" Elijah asked. "Like the teleportation feature associated with the branch?" Biggle shook his head. "No. That is often far too expensive for planetary travel. Normally, there are mages who specialize in such things," he said. "On my home world, it is still too expensive for the likes of me, but for, more prosperous people, using that network is no great burden. I have never seen such things, though. My village was too remote and far too poor to qualify for a hub." "So what's the point of branch teleportation?" Elijah asked. "Interplanetary transport," Biggle stated. There are ships capable of moving between worlds and universes, but that is only viable on a large scale. Or if someone is obscenely wealthy. Or powerful, though the two normally come hand in hand, from my experience. I see, Elijah said. This is so cool, Miguel said, having circled the dolmen, running his hands over each hailstone. It's like the one outside of Seattle, right? Except it's different. The rocks are different, but the carvings are too. Why? That's the nature of inspiration, Elijah stated. What is a Seattle? Asked Biggle, struggling to wrap his name around the city's name. Clearly, he had no idea what it was. Don't worry about it. Come on. We're on the clock here, Elijah said. They had 6 days to accomplish his goals, and given that one of those goals involved trekking into a swamp, he knew they'd be pushing it to get everything done in time. So he led his small group away from the Dragon Circle and toward Argos. How far have we come? Biggle asked, struggling to keep up. His short legs were definitely a weakness when it came to trekking across the wilderness. Though it had never seemed to bother Kuruk, who was only a bit taller than the gnome. So maybe it was more to say that the alchemist's class didn't give him the tools to overcome the shortcomings of his race. About 1,000 miles. Maybe. I didn't exactly keep track when I was traveling, Elijah answered. It could be closer to 2,000, but I don't think so. I ended up backtracking a lot in the more mountainous regions. Impressive, Biggle said, glancing back the way they'd come. They were well away from the Dragon Circle, so he couldn't see the dolmen. Still, Elijah thought he knew what the alchemist was thinking. So he decided to cut any issues off at the pass, saying, "You will not visit one of my circles without my permission or accompaniment." What? You heard me, Biggle. I've been told to watch out for alchemists. I've heard that people like you can get a bit greedy. I'm not saying you're one of those sorts of alchemists, but I am cautioning you to leave my things alone. I see, Biggle said. For what it's worth, I was only curious about how it all worked. I had no intention of doing whatever it is you're afraid I would do. I prefer to grow my own ingredients, not harvest them from nature. Good, Elijah said. After that, the trio trekked across the terrain until, at last, they reached Argos. It had fully recovered from the tempest that had swept through the area, which only highlighted how impressive construction classes were and how quickly they could complete a project. Eventually, they would reach a point where they could easily build structures to rival anything from the old world. And they would assuredly be equipped with all the modern amenities. It was only a matter of time. And survival. In any case, the two guards on duty recognized Elijah, so after only a few moments' worth of polite conversation, they waved him through. Elijah found it notable that they'd barely even looked at Biggle, indicating that they had encountered non-humans before. Soon enough, he found himself walking into Atticus' shop. "Ah, good to see you, friend," the tall, hawk-nosed merchant said. "I was just thinking of you. And you brought guests. Any friend of Elijah's is a friend of Atticus. I will even give you a discount. 2% off any weapon in my shop. Quality guaranteed, of course." Elijah grinned at his friend. Even with his morose tendencies of late, he couldn't help but smile when seeing Atticus. The man was so full of joy for life that it became infectious. "I have some things I'd like appraised. And I'm sure I'll want to sell some, too." With that, Atticus led them into the back, where they stated the process of identifying each item. The first was the ghoul hide satchel, which turned out to feature a 15% weight reduction and a trait called preservation, which, true to the name, kept any perishable goods fresh for twice the duration as normal. "A great item," Atticus said. "I would offer to purchase it, but it appears you have grown quite attached to it." "A good call, my friend. One can never carry enough goods." Next came the weighted gloves, which, according to Atticus, would increase his unarmed damage by 20%. Elijah had expected something like that, but he was impressed with the degree to which it would augment his attacks. The canteen was, predictably, called an everlasting canteen, but to Elijah's surprise, it hadn't originated with a tower or rift. Instead, Atticus informed him that it had a creator's name attached to it, Rajesh Beatty. There was no more information, though Elijah was definitely interested in finding the maker. After all, with something like that, Seattle's water supply issues could be solved much more easily. The spear Thor had used was called Ancestor's Spear, and it had an ability that allowed the wielder to recall it once thrown. Elijah had seen that in action during his fight with the Viking, so he knew precisely how useful such an ability would be. However, he still had no intention of using it himself. He'd grown accustomed to his staves, and he had no desire to change what had worked so far. Neither had Miguel expressed any interest in the weapon. He seemed to prefer swords, from what Elijah could tell, so he intended to sell it to Atticus. Fortunately, the merchant was willing to pay good coins for the item, probably because Argos had a culture of spear use. I blame Delilah. All the young men want to impress her with their spear work. Most of the young women, too, Atticus said with a shake of his head. Too bad most are too weak to use this monster. Still, I know of a few strong fighters who would pay a premium for a high simple grade weapon with such a useful ability. After that, they set it aside until they got to the negotiation part. There were still a few items left to go, and Elijah preferred to sell everything together. There were only 2 other items for which Elijah had high hopes, and he wanted to save the most interesting one for last. So he ended up having quite a few daggers and a few crude-grade swords appraised, none of which were nice enough to pass on to Miguel, considering that his mother could make him better weapons when he came of age, before finally arriving at the penultimate item, the fanged necklace he'd taken from Thor. Interesting, Atticus said. It's called a wolf totem. I'm guessing that's the origin of the teeth, though it's clearly a system reward. What's it do? +3 to all attributes, the merchant answered. Powerful. But it's a complex grade item, so that's to be expected. The trait attached to it is even more interesting, though. Adds 15% duration to all afflictions. Oh. Nice, Elijah said. That was as good as a 15% increase to the damage of Swarm, Contagion, and Venom Strike, which meant he was definitely going to wear it. It also explained why the Hunter's debuff had lasted so long. That should help. Very good indeed, my friend. All right. I only have one last item to check, Elijah said, handing over his staff. He'd yet to bond it, largely because on the off chance that it was unsuitable, binding it to himself would render it worthless. Still, he thought that unlikely, given the name. Dragon-touched staff, Atticus said. Adds 15 points to strength and dexterity, with 5 to constitution. It also has a trait that increases the power of all enhancements by a flat 5 points. That is unheard of. Do you know how valuable this is? Priceless, Elijah said. A less honest merchant would steal this from you, Atticus said, handing it back to Elijah without hesitation. But they don't call me honest Atticus for nothing. No one calls you that. They might. I've never heard it. Neither have I, but I assume that's only because they don't want to stroke my ego. Everyone knows how humble I am, Atticus said without a hint of humor. Right. You're the humblest man I know. That's what I keep telling people. Elijah just smiled wryly and shook his head. All right, so how much for the pile, he asked. The collection of items included the nearly worthless to Elijah, at least weapons, as well as the Ancestor's Spear. Elijah also threw in Thor's armor, though Atticus confirmed that even the best piece was only low crude grade, which meant that the set was almost useless for anything but disassembling it for parts. Still, Elijah wanted it out of his satchel, so he insisted that Atticus include it. The bickering was a long and arduous, though good-natured, process. Every now and then, Miguel would break in to ask a question about something he'd found in Atticus' storeroom, but the merchant didn't mind it at all. Eventually, they came to an agreement, with the entire collection bringing Elijah almost 50 silver coins. Once they exchanged the sum via folios, which was a new addition on Atticus' part, Elijah said, "Oh. I meant to tell you this earlier. My sister-in-law is a blacksmith, and she's going to be making some new equipment sometime soon. She's getting her forge set up right now, but I expect her to get to work within a few weeks. I might bring some of her products around, once she's up and running. I don't know, my friend. This is not a place for amateur work. She's on the power rankings, Elijah said. And I think she's capable of creating complex items under the right circumstances. Which is why someone of her stature, skill, and no doubt, beauty will be more than welcome to display her wares in my shop, the merchant said, switching gears without missing a beat. Though Miguel mouthed the word gross when Atticus mentioned Carmen's beauty. Thought that might interest you, Elijah said with a grin. Just wanted to let you know so you'll have enough money to make some purchases. Wouldn't want you to miss out. After that, Atticus told Elijah about Thor's visit to Argos, which elicited quite a lot of genuine laughter from everyone in the storeroom. But in the end, it was soon time for them to get going. Not only did Elijah want to introduce Miguel to the glories of Greek food, but he also wanted to visit Isaac and maybe Delilah, if she was in town, before turning in for the night. Because in the morning, they would set off for the swamp, where they would hopefully save some children. After visiting Isaac's house and catching up over a cup of tea, during which Artemis jumped in Miguel's lap, where she remained the entire time, they went to dinner, where they were served spanakopita. Everyone enjoyed it at least as much as Elijah, which was gratifying. After that, they headed to the inn, where they rented a pair of rooms, one to be shared by Elijah and Miguel, and another for Biggle from Agatha, who seemed delighted to see Elijah. Everyone seems to like you here, Biggle remarked as they climbed the stairs. Fortunately, he didn't have any issues with that despite his size. Surprising. How so? You don't give off the most approachable aura, the gnomish alchemist stated. Most people in Ironshore are terrified of you, and for good reason. That's only because I killed a few people. As I said, a good reason, the gnome stated. In any case, I look forward to meeting this other alchemist. I have had few opportunities to discuss my craft with someone with the same class, though that chemist has all sorts of delightful ideas. I look forward to working with her as well. You humans are full of surprises. After that, the group separated, and once Miguel was settled and asleep, Elijah silently left the room, and headed back to Atticus' shop. For his part, the weapons dealer seemed surprised to see Elijah. I'm sorry, my friend. I am not up for celebrations tonight, he said. It's not about that. I wanted to ask for you to keep an eye out for a couple of things, Elijah said. Then, he told Atticus what he was looking for. Afterwards he said, I don't know if you'll find what I want, but I'm throwing out a pretty wide net. Hopefully, someone will find something suitable. Indeed. I'll keep watch for anything that might work, my friend. Then, seeing that Atticus was in no mood to entertain guests, Elijah said his goodbyes and headed back to the inn. He'd already found that Delilah was once again out of town this time, running the local tower with her team, so he had nowhere else he wanted to visit. Except maybe the tavern, though he resisted that urge. He had no wish to become an alcoholic, after all, so even if it might have felt temporarily good to once again drown his sorrows in an ocean of alcohol, he knew it was a bad idea. Still, it was difficult. After returning to the inn, he slept poorly, and when he rose the next morning, he felt even more anxious to get on with the task at hand. He'd spent most of the night lying awake and thinking about his sister, or more accurately, her death, which did not put him in the best frame of mind. If the lives of children weren't at stake, he might have abandoned everything else and flown off to Easton at that very moment. But he'd promised Konstantinos that he would help, so help he would. Elijah rose before dawn, and he was happy to see that Miguel did the same, though he did grumble a little about how early it was. Soon enough, the pair had taken care of morning necessities, and even as the sun had begun to rise, they went to fetch Biggle. The gnome was clearly not an early riser by habit, but when he saw Elijah's no-nonsense expression, he hurried to ready himself for the day's travel. Only a few minutes later, he joined Elijah and Miguel as they ate a breakfast of fat sausages and fluffy eggs as prepared by Agatha. The meal was just as amazing as always, and all three ate with the gusto of starving men. Miguel put away enough for 3 people, reminding Elijah what it was like to have once been that age. Back then, he'd eaten his parents out of house and home, and he hadn't slowed down until after college. That was the joy of a youthful metabolism. Though that prompted the realization that Elijah probably didn't have to worry too much about overconsumption anymore. Even if he wasn't so active, he suspected that it would take a truly impressive degree of sloth for his body to degrade on its own. And besides, he was only 31 years old. With his cultivation and attributes, that meant that he was less than 10% into his expected lifespan. In any event, they finished their meal, and after Elijah paid, they set off, leaving Argos behind and heading in the direction of the swamp. In the past, Elijah had taken a roundabout path, only turning south when he hit the ravine that cut across the terrain. However, he expected that the trip would be much faster this time around, largely because they intended to travel directly toward the swamp. The issue with that assumption soon became apparent, though. "It's not my fault you're giants," Biggle complained, pumping his legs to keep up. "Even with my pep-it-up potion, I can't wait. What are you doing? Stop that. Stop that this instant." "Sorry," Elijah said, having placed Biggle on his shoulders like a toddler. He could remember doing the same for his nephew when Miguel was only a couple of years old. Elijah had come home for the holidays, and they'd gone to visit the local botanical gardens that had been decorated with colorful Christmas lights. But predictably, the much younger Miguel had been incapable of keeping up, so Elijah had put the boy on his shoulders, where he'd remained for most of the outing. "I'm not going to slow down just to accommodate you. This is faster. It's also humiliating. There's no one out here to judge you," Elijah reminded him. "I mean, we could fly, I guess. But I'm thinking you might enjoy that even less." That shut the gnome up. He didn't want to travel in the talons of Elijah's shape of the sky, after all. For his part, Elijah would have preferred to avoid that, too. As convenient as flight was, he wasn't quite ready to transport passengers any meaningful distance. For one, landing was still an issue that had yet to be resolved. He could manage it, but he knew that if he didn't possess superhuman durability, he'd have already broken his legs many times over. It would be markedly worse if he was carrying someone. So they strode through the wilderness, with Biggle on his shoulders. As they did, Elijah held a conversation with his nephew, and eventually, the topic turned to the boy's future. "So have you figured out what you want to do?" he asked. Miguel shook his head. "No. I don't even know what archetypes I'll be offered. I just don't want to be a scholar," he said. Surprised, Biggle asked, "Why ever not? Scholars lead to some incredibly valuable classes." Miguel shrugged. "But they seem so useless." "That's untrue," Biggle stated. "Every archetype has the potential for immortality. They all perform valuable and necessary functions as well. Warriors fight. Rangers scout. Scholars learn. Without merchants, fair trade would be impossible. Without administrators, our cities would not function. There is no useless archetype. Only useless people." "How many archetypes are there?" Miguel asked. 12. "So many?" asked Elijah. He'd only encountered a fraction of that number. After that, Biggle listed the archetypes. Warrior, Ranger, Druid, Sorcerer, and Healer, Elijah already knew. However, there were still quite a few others. Scholars, for one. Tradesmen, who became various crafters. Merchants like Atticus. Entertainers, many of which had powerful abilities to increase the power of those who enjoyed their performances. Then there were administrators, tacticians, and explorers as well. And from there, we have innumerable classes. Most are hybrids, taking bits from archetypes other than the root, Biggle explained. My point is that there are many choices, and while the archetype is incredibly important, choosing the wrong option is something that can be rectified through progression. The class choice is one opportunity, but then there are specializations at level 100. After that, each time a person enters a new realm of power, they have the opportunity to evolve their class. Most will simply take a more powerful version of their own. However, there are those who choose to correct past mistakes by slowly shifting their path to one they deem more appropriate. It is a fascinating subject, really. How do you know all this? Asked Miguel. My mother was a scholar. She studied classes and advised the local lord on how to guide his children in the proper direction, he admitted. He didn't like it when his firstborn son was only offered non-combat archetypes, though. So, we were forced to flee. Everyone in Ironshore seems to have a similar story. Not the specifics. Just that they all seem to be running from something. It was the same with the elves. Elves? Oh. Yeah. There's a city of elves living in a desert a little ways away. They sounded more like pioneers, though. Like they came here for opportunity that didn't exist on their world. I see. That is usually the case with people who come to a newly touched world. It is the frontier, without much in the way of safety. However, there is opportunity to forge your own path, which attracts a certain type of person, Biggle explained. Though I would be willing to wager that there are a couple of advanced settlements here. They may be talented junior members of a sect meant to fuel their progression in an unsettled world. Or they could represent various other interests. Those are the ones you need to watch out for. They'll be well-equipped, knowledgeable, and driven. In a world like this, that can be a dangerous combination. Elijah nodded, continuing on with his conversation with Miguel. The young man had no idea what direction his development might take, but Elijah didn't blame him for that. After all, he was still a child. It would have been odd if he'd known those sorts of things with any certainty, and the fact that he was still unsure meant that he was at least giving it some thought, rather than simply going for whatever sounded coolest. Eventually, almost 2 days later, they reached the swamp, after which Elijah was forced to transform into a lamellar ape so that his 2 companions could climb atop his shoulders and avoid the many dangers of walking through the murky water. For his part, Elijah seemed to avoid the worst of it, just as he had during his first trip through the swamp. Still, because of where they'd entered, it took an extra day for them to reach Constantino's compound, and when they did, they were greeted by Bessie, the guardian alligator. Elijah responded to her charge by tossing her the last hunk of desert snake he still had in his satchel. She gobbled it up, returning to her position beneath the compound's largest building. "Lo there," yelled Constantinos from the deck. He was wearing a pair of overalls and nothing else, which put his incredibly skinny torso on full display. He didn't seem self-conscious about it, though. "Didn't think you'd be back." Elijah climbed onto the floating dock, and after Miguel and Biggle descended from his shoulders, he took on his human form. Then, he began the arduous process of cleaning the muck from his lower body while plucking any pesky leeches free. Fortunately, he'd only picked up a few small ones, and it only took a quick pulse of soothe to get rid of the afflictions they'd carried. Once he was done, he shook Constantino's hand, saying, "I said I had a friend who might be able to help." He nodded at Biggle, adding, "This is that friend. He's an alchemist, just like you, but he might have some knowledge you don't." After that, Biggle and Constantinos started a conversation that lost Elijah after only a few moments. Luckily, they were quickly rescued by Marcy, who escorted them inside after Elijah showered the rest of the muck off, where she served them mugs of tea. Then, she told the story of how a giant man had come by only a couple of months before. He stormed up, half dead from all the leeches, Marcy explained. Said he was looking for a druid or some such. Kenny sent him traipsing off into the swamp, but his soft heart got the better of him, so he gave him some potions. I would not have done that. But I'm not as nice as Kenny. Where are the kids? Elijah asked, looking around. In the other buildin', she said. Bryce is teachin' 'em their numbers and such. You all right in here by yourselves? I got dinner to tend to. Elijah said that he was, while Miguel was still entranced by his surroundings. Despite everything he'd been through, he'd lived a pretty sheltered, suburban life before the world had been transformed. As such, he had never been exposed to much in the way of other cultures. Sure, he'd visited some of Carmen's family, though only a couple of times because they didn't precisely approve of her sexuality. Elijah didn't know the whole story, but he did know that the resulting falling out was why she'd left Southern California for Washington State. Either way, Miguel certainly had never seen anything like the compound. It was cozy in a way that only a true home could be, which clearly reminded the young man of everything he'd lost. So Elijah decided to distract him. "So I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About your future." "I know you've been working with Colt," Elijah said. "And he speaks highly of your skills. But I think it would be a shame if you let yourself be pigeonholed like that. You need more than just the ability to swing a sword. I can use a spear too. And an axe, but I'm not that good yet. I'm a good shot with a bow too. I'm not talking about weapons training. I want you to train with a friend of mine," Elijah said. "I haven't spoken to him about it, but I think I know him well enough to know what he'll say." "What kind of friend? And training in what?" "A dwarven friend. He's a scout for Ironshore, and he's probably the highest level fighter they have." "Higher than you?" "I'm not part of Ironshore. So, no. Not even close." "What if I want to train with you instead?" Elijah sighed, leaning back into the couch. It was upholstered in a truly garish fabric, but it was extremely soft and comfortable. "You don't want to train with me," he said with a sigh. "Most of what I know isn't really transferable. If you end up with the Druid archetype, I won't hesitate to teach you. But I hope you don't." "Why?" Miguel asked, a little hurt. "Because it's not a strong archetype. Not right off, at least. It's a blend of scholar, healer, and sorcerer. So I can do a lot of things, but until I got my class, I couldn't do any of them well. Even now, strength to strength, I can't stand against someone with a more focused class. My cultivation helps, and I intend to put you on the right path with that. But being a druid isn't about learning fancy techniques or doing sword katas. It's about connection. Instinct. It's a mindset more than an archetype. So unless you decided to follow me down this road, there's nothing I can teach you better than someone like Keurig or Colt. Not about fighting, at least." That wasn't what Miguel wanted to hear, and as a result, he went quiet. Elijah tried to re-engage, but after a few one-word answers, he gave up. Clearly, he had a lot to learn about dealing with kids. "These children are remarkable," said Biggle. "I wish I had access to a physician to understand precisely what's happening here." The kids who were all lined up in front of the gnome were mostly taller than Biggle, but they all beamed at the apparent compliment. One even threw his hands into the air in celebration. However, Elijah knew that none of them save for Bryce, perhaps had any clue what he was talking about. "What's the difference between a healer and a physician?" asked Bryce, who looked uncomfortable at the scrutiny she'd just endured. Biggle didn't have much use for boundaries, so after feeding each of the children some concoction that he claimed would make things clearer for him, he'd leaned in close enough that his overlarge nose touched her cheek. "I thought they were the same thing." "Ah, that's a common mistake. A physician is a scholar class. While a healer specializes in fixing problems, a physician's main purpose is diagnosis. They endeavor to understand, rather than heal. Though many of them possess some ability in the latter," Biggle said. "Tell me, child, you weren't with these other children in the beginning, were you?" No. I was adopted before the apocalypse." "Apocalypse?" Biggle asked, clearly confused. Then, his eyes widened in understanding. "Ah. I can see why you humans would see the touch of the world tree in such a light. But this is no apocalypse. It is an opportunity. Think of it like the great forest moths. They begin life as the spotted caterpillar, no larger than you are now, but then they undergo a transformation that lets them take to the skies. They grow so large that they can block the small sun." "A caterpillar as big as me," she gasped. "That's... You don't have those here?" asked Biggle. "No, we don't," Elijah said, smiling slightly. Our caterpillars are usually smaller than a finger. What? That makes no sense. How would the moth grow so large, then? Moths are tiny, Bryce said. She's right, Miguel pointed out, staring at the girl. If she'd noticed the intensity of his gaze, she might have been a bit uncomfortable. Thankfully, she hadn't recognized the young man's clear infatuation. In retrospect, it should have been predictable. They weren't far off in age, and Miguel clearly hadn't encountered many girls over the past couple of years. Moths are really small. Elijah nearly chuckled at Miguel's pointless contribution to the conversation, but instead, kept his mouth shut as Biggle said, "That is troubling." He shook his head. "But never mind your oddly sized moths. My point is that you didn't endure the same transformation that blessed these children. When they come of age, provided they survive that long, they will be well on their way to the first stage of body cultivation. I have never seen something so remarkable." "What does it mean?" asked Konstantinos. "Two things," Biggle said, holding up two tiny fingers. "First, you saved these children's lives. That concoction you've been feeding them is primitive but inspired. That's the difference between a passable tradesman and an exceptional one. Creativity. It's what separates us from those less talented. Humility, too," Elijah pointed out. "Bah. Humility. What use is it? If you're good, let the world know." Biggle insisted, emphatically thrusting his finger toward the ceiling. Elijah rolled his eyes. "What's the other thing?" "The second is that I know how to help them," Biggle stated, puffing out his chest. He addressed Konstantinos, who still wore a pair of denim overalls with no shirt. Otherwise, he had on a straw hat, with what looked like a piece of swamp grass sticking out from between his lips. "It's a pill meant to do the same thing your little potions have done. The difference is that it'll last a lot longer." "How much longer?" asked the other alchemist. "Well, you're getting a day or two out of your version, right?" "They get dosed every day," Konstantinos answered. "And it's yucky," one of the children shouted. Another mimed like she was vomiting, while yet another pointed at his open mouth while he wore a grimace. "This pill will last at least a month. Maybe 2. And it uses ingredients that grow all over the place. Not just this damnable swamp," Biggle said, punctuating that statement by slapping his hand against his neck, killing a mundane mosquito. "There were much bigger ones out in the swamp." "That's if you don't want me to cure them." "Course we want you to cure 'em," said Marcy. "Why wouldn't we? It's complicated, but the gist of it is that these kids' bodies are being tempered, much like what's required for body cultivation," Biggle said. "It's a dangerous practice, but it's not entirely unheard of. The problem is that if the mix is wrong even by a little bit, it'll kill the subjects." "Are they in danger? Left untreated?" "Absolutely. They would die within a few days," Biggle said. "But because of your husband's efforts, calamity has become an advantage. The conditions in the swamp struck the perfect balance, naturally creating a situation that would require an alchemist far more skilled than me to engineer. But I can cure them. I can turn them back to normal. I know a potion that would do the trick. However, that would squander the opportunity in front of them. A body of wood. Before they even begin their path of progression. It would be an immense advantage, and one that would set them up for success. But we'd have to leave the poison," guessed Konstantinos. "And if they miss one dose?" "It's too dangerous," said Marcy. Konstantinos was obviously less convinced. Perhaps he knew how much of an advantage body cultivation could prove to be. Or maybe he simply took Biggle at his word. Either way, the decision was far more complicated than it might seem. Sure, there was danger. But if that danger was properly managed, the potential rewards could be incredible. After that, Konstantinos and Marcy sent the children away, while they retreated into a back room to discuss the issue. For his part, Elijah hoped they would take the path Biggle described, but he could understand their hesitation. When a child's life hung in the balance, risks were difficult to embrace, even if logic dictated that one should do so. In the end, they did not reach a decision before Elijah, Biggle, and Miguel, much to the last one's regret, left. However, Biggle did give Constantinos the recipe for the pill meant to manage the poison as well as the concoction that would cure them. That gave them the tools to make whatever choice they felt most comfortable with. Meanwhile, Miguel had mustered his courage and asked Bryce to visit him in his magical grove. The girl clearly didn't believe the following description, but she half-heartedly promised that she would try to visit if she ever got the chance. That put Miguel on cloud nine, even though to Elijah, it seemed pretty obvious that she was just being polite. He had no intention of telling the young man, though. In any case, both Miguel and Biggle were in great moods as they returned the way they'd come. What made it even better was the fact that Constantinos consented to usher them to the edge of the swamp on one of his boats. So Elijah didn't even need to get his scales wet. The trip back to Argos was equally uneventful, save for the fact that Elijah took the two by the ravine, where they saw one of the massive spiders ambush another bird. That delighted Miguel, but Biggle found it horrifying, prompting a discussion on how the gnomish alchemist could find giant moths so normal, while an enormous spider terrified him. Elijah barely listened as the pair bickered. His obligations were nearly satisfied, which meant that he was on the verge of setting out for Easton. When he got there, he would exact his revenge. At present, the only question was whether or not he intended to hold the whole city accountable for his sister's death and Carmen's as well as Miguel's exile, or if he would only take vengeance on Roman. He had yet to decide, but Elijah knew the time would come when the choice was forced upon him, one way or another. In any case, they arrived in Argos a couple of days later, which meant that they had a free day. So Elijah allowed Miguel to wander the town alone, while he stopped by Atticus' shop to see if the merchant had had any luck filling his requests. "No luck, my friend. I have some items that would fit," Atticus answered with a shake of his head. "But they're nothing special. I feel certain that I will have a chance to obtain the equipment you require in a month or so. There are a few scheduled tower runs upcoming, which usually results in an influx of inventory. We have also been getting more traders of late." "Really?" "Yes. From a wide variety of places, too. I'm told there is a tribe of nomadic hunters who reside on the plains past the swamp to the south. Some of my products come from their forays into that region's towers. We've seen quite a few traveling merchants as well," Atticus explained. "I only wish Argos had more dedicated crafters. We've a few decent leatherworkers, builders, and quite a lot of farmers. No blacksmiths or tailors, though. Once Carmen gets settled, hopefully we can figure something out," Elijah said. "If she's as good as you say, we will all get very rich," he exclaimed. Elijah shrugged. "I'm told she's good, but I've never seen her products," he said honestly. "In any case, I'll be heading back home tomorrow, but I'll try to stop by here sometime soon." With that, Elijah returned to his hotel room, where he got started on the next phase of his cultivation. He knew the basics of how to take the next step with his core, but he'd only spent a little time practicing the technique. It required him to take in as much Ethera as he could, enough to make him feel like he was going to burst, then swirl it around before expelling it as slowly as possible. To Elijah, it was a little like taking a long, deep breath, then holding it in, though with the added difficulty of doing some calisthenics along the way. It wasn't a perfect analogy, but it described the process well enough for him. Regardless, he quickly found the first issue. The Ethera density in Argos was severely lacking, and as a result, it took almost 10 minutes for his core to reach complete saturation. Then, another 10 to push it to its uncomfortable limit. But even then, it felt hollow. Like he should have been filling a balloon with water, but all he had was air. It was the best he could do, though, and he spent the next half hour swirling the Ethera around until he could hold it no longer. Then, he let it out. Almost an hour, and he'd done very little good. He couldn't even notice any difference, even though he knew it should have expanded ever so slightly. To him, the activity seemed a lot like working out. It was meant to be a long process, and he wouldn't notice improvement for a while. He kept going, though, repeating the cycle a few more times before he started to lose focus. He probably would have continued, but Miguel's return was distracting enough to throw a wrench into those plans. So, after his nephew excitedly described his foray into Argos, Elijah broached the subject they'd begun to discuss on the way to the swamp. "Would you like to train with Keurig?" "If so, I can set it up when we get back," Elijah said. "Don't feel obligated to agree, though. If you have no interest in learning the skills he can teach, then it would just be a waste of time." Miguel narrowed his eyes. "Why wouldn't I want to do it? I would have given anything to have those skills after we were exiled," he said. "All right, then. I guess that settles that," Elijah said. He glanced at the window, seeing that darkness had completely settled over Argos. "Get some sleep. We're going to leave early in the morning." Miguel quickly agreed, but even after the lights were extinguished, sleep was elusive and for both of them. Miguel was clearly too excited for slumber, but Elijah had other things on his mind. Because now that he'd met his obligations with Constantinos, he only had one more task to accomplish before setting off for Easton. Once he'd introduced Miguel to Keurig, who he still hadn't asked to mentor the kid, there would be nothing else, aside from a few preparations for the journey, to delay his departure. And now that it was so close, Elijah was eager to get started. Excitement wasn't the right word. Nor was anxiety. Instead, it was a mixture of both, with a healthy dose of dread thrown in. Some righteous indignation, too. A sense of serving justice as well. To put it mildly, he was beset by a snarl of varied emotions that were extremely difficult to identify. The end result, though, was that he looked forward to looking his sister's murderer in the face, and watching the light life leave his eyes. That, at least, was a comforting thought that ushered him into sleep. Elijah awoke a little before dawn, but he didn't immediately rise. For one, he didn't want to wake Miguel, but for another, he wanted to spend an hour cycling Ethera through his core. He wanted to create a routine that would, over time, better prepare him for success. So he pushed himself to a seated position, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes before getting down to the task at hand. This time, it took him a little longer to saturate his core, which he took as a good sign, but he cut himself off after only one cycle. The rising sun told him that it was time to get on with the primary objective. With that in mind, he woke Miguel, who rose and turned an accusatory, bleary-eyed gaze in Elijah's direction. "What's the rush? We could sleep in," he complained. "Sleeping in is how everyone else gets ahead of you," Elijah cautioned. "That's what my dad used to tell me. When I was your age, I didn't really believe him, but now, I realize he was a lot smarter than I ever gave him credit for back then." Miguel asked, "What was he like?" "Old and wise." "Come on. Be serious." "Ouch," Elijah muttered, running his hand through his hair. Having a 13-year-old chastise him for not being serious was a bit of a blow to the concept of his own maturity. "Fine. He was about my height. Maybe a little taller. And he had the kind of tan you only get from spending years outside. He never wanted to be indoors. Whenever he wasn't working, he wanted to be camping. Or fishing. Hunting, maybe. Sometimes, he just went hiking. Your mom and I used to go with him all the time. So did Mom. She liked to gather herbs and stuff. Mushrooms, too. Those were good times." "They got in a car wreck, right?" Miguel asked, his voice small. Elijah nodded. "Yeah. One day they were there. Happy. Healthy. Like two monuments that I thought would never disappear. But then, the next day, I was standing outside as your mom identified their bodies," Elijah said. "It didn't feel real. Not to me. Not until the funeral. But even after that, for years, I would turn around and half expect them to be there. That was why he ran away after high school. Sure, he usually categorized it as going off to college, but in reality, he'd done it to escape the memory of his dead parents. It hadn't really worked. Only time could do that. But he'd been a stupid kid with equally dumb ideas. But without the things they taught me, I never would have survived the touch of the world tree, Elijah said, surprised that, even after all this time, no tears came. Usually, they did when he really thought about his parents. Though I thought I was a better campfire cook before everything happened. I mean, I wasn't good. I used to joke that I could burn water. But it wasn't. That's because you don't have a cooking skill, Miguel said. Right? What? A cooking skill? Yeah. Lots of people have them, his nephew explained. It's part of one of the archetypes. Maybe a couple of them. But without it, food just kind of tastes bland. Before everything happened with Mom, we went to school, and my teacher, Mr. Gary, said that it was because of Ethera. Like, our bodies need it, so if food doesn't have enough of it or something, it ends up tasting bland. That's where the different cooking skills come in. They inject Ethera into normal food. Elijah just stared at him. It explained so much. Maybe the problem wasn't that the crabs on his island didn't taste good. The issue was with him, and his lack of cooking skills. Perhaps those same crabs, cooked by someone with actual ability, would taste amazing. It also put some of his other experiences into perspective. Like how every time he visited a new town, he found someone whose cooking was even better than what one would expect in a 5-star restaurant. "Are you okay?" asked Miguel. "You just blew my mind." "Huh? I need to hire someone that can cook," Elijah said, his mind already going to his coffee project. What would happen if he roasted the beans himself? Would the product be inferior? He hoped not, but he wasn't willing to take that chance. Sure, now that the trees were approaching maturity, they would bear fruit far more often, but he didn't want to waste his precious coffee cherries on a failed endeavor. After all, the whole point was to make delicious coffee that had beneficial properties like his grove berries. If he ruined that by roasting his own beans, he'd never forgive himself. He shook his head. "You just added an item to my to-do list," Elijah said. "Thankfully, it can wait. Until after you kill Roman." "Yes. He saved my life, you know." "Why would he do that?" "He barely knew me. When that other guy took me, I thought I was going to die. Then, when he gave me to Roman, I thought he'd use me against Mom. But he didn't. He was furious. Killed the kidnapper in like a second. And I still don't know why," Miguel said. Elijah didn't know either, and he said as much. However, he added, "But it doesn't matter. From the situation your mom described, I think it's safe to say that he's at least deluded. Maybe he had a psychotic break. Or he might have just always been an asshole that draws the line at messing with kids. I really don't know. He is going to die, though. Probably painfully." He'd considered sugarcoating the reality of what was coming, but he figured Miguel deserved to know the unfettered truth. To that end, he'd vowed to be completely honest with his nephew. But that didn't mean he reveled in that conversation, so it wasn't long after that statement before he rose and headed to the bathroom. Less than an hour later, he, Miguel, and Biggle were marching toward Argo's gate. Elijah had hoped that a visit to the city would help him to deal with his sister's death, and the anger that had come with it, but if anything, it had only made things worse. It only took a few hours to reach the Dragon Circle, so they were forced to sit around for another hour before Elijah's cooldown ran out. When it did, he opened a gate, and everyone stepped through and into Elijah's grove. That was when he realized the issue. Biggle stumbled, staring around the grove, wide-eyed. "Shit," Elijah muttered. "What is this place?" "The Ethera density, those berries." Elijah grabbed the alchemist by the collar before he could run off. Then, he knelt beside the gnome and said, "This is my grove, Biggle. I like you. I think we're on the verge of being friends. But if you come to this grove without my permission, I won't hesitate to kill you. The same goes for anyone else in Ironshore." "I would never." Biggle insisted, struggling to free himself. "It didn't work." "Sure. I know that. I'm just letting you know the rules. You're the only Ironshore resident other than Kurik and the human refugees who've seen this grove, Elijah said. I'll caution you not to spread any information about what you've seen here. I don't want to have to kill a bunch of people just to make a point. Do you have any idea what you have here? Biggle asked, looking around. This grove could fuel the progression of 100 fighters. Maybe 1,000. The potions I could make, the pills I could create. He trailed off, then sighed. It's for the best. I don't have the expertise to utilize ingredients of this quality, he admitted. I can't even identify most of these things. Even if you could. Hands off, Biggle said, raising his tiny hands. You have my word. I knew I could count on you, Elijah stated. And if it turns out I can't, well, it wouldn't be the first time I've killed a gnome. Biggle swallowed hard, then said, You truly are a violent person. You know that? I'm whatever I need to be, Elijah countered, releasing the gnome. Biggle straightened his collar, but he didn't respond. Instead, he seemed eager to leave the grove behind, which Elijah thought was for the best. In truth, he had never seen himself as a violent person. However, some things were worth protecting, and sometimes, that meant letting the more feral side of himself out. Besides, a few threats were preferable to having to slaughter a bunch of unwelcome visitors, which he would unhesitatingly do if they invaded his grove. Or threatened his family. In any case, he led Biggle to the beach, then used one of the rowboats to return him to Ironshore. Meanwhile, Miguel went to train near the old cabin. He only paid attention to the young man for long enough to know that he was in no danger before turning his attention to other matters. While he was in Ironshore, Elijah spent some time topping off his supplies before returning to his island. He hated using the rowboat, but if he didn't take it back, no one else would pick up the slack. So he got to rowing, and when he reached the island, he retrieved his old jars, filled them with a scentless oil he'd bought in Ironshore, then stuffed a bunch of lavender into each one. By the time he finished taking his revenge, the infused oil would be ready for another batch of soap. He'd just finished that task when Carmen returned to the island. He'd considered stopping by her new smithy, but he hadn't wanted to disturb her. So he waited until she got back to the grove before heading out to meet her. It's time, isn't it? She guessed. Elijah nodded. I'm leaving in the morning. Then, he described his plan. His intention was to use the individual teleportation function of roots of the world tree, which worked on a different cooldown than the gate portion, to travel to the Circle of Spears outside of Seattle. Then, he would use Shape of Air to fly to Easton. Hopefully, he could reach the city in a day or two. I don't know how long I'll stay there. It depends on if I want to destroy the city, he remarked. You think you can do that? She asked, her face smudged with soot. Elijah shrugged. Maybe. Not quickly, though, he said. Calamity could do a lot of damage, and in a wide area, but it was not strong enough to tear down buildings. It would take a while. He expected Carmen to argue on behalf of Easton, but she didn't. Instead, she said, make him suffer. I will, Elijah promised. Indeed, that was one of the reasons he was even considering the city's total destruction. From what Carmen had said, Roman valued that city more than anything, so its destruction would assuredly cause him more pain than anything else Elijah could do. But more than anything, I need you to survive, Carmen stated, reaching out to grip his arm. Miguel is safe here. It's been so long since we had that. And without you, that all disappears. So, survive. Elijah intended to do that too. But if it came down to a choice between taking his revenge and his own death, Elijah wasn't certain which route he would choose. Hopefully, it wouldn't come down to that. I talked to a friend while I was in Ironshore. Kurik. He's a scout, Elijah said. He's coming by tomorrow to pick Miguel up. It's not quite an apprenticeship that won't come unless Miggy gets the right archetype and class. But it's training. Kurik's going to show him woodcraft, trapping, and hunting. I told him that it was all subject to your approval, though, so if you don't want it to happen, just tell Kuruk when he comes by. You're willing to let him into the grove? Asked Carmen. Elijah nodded. He's a friend, he said. I trust him. Then so do I, Carmen stated, adding that the plan had her approval. Well, since I'm not leaving until the morning, do you and Miggy want to go have a last meal at the Stuck Pig? Hopefully, they're not still serving orc ribs, he said. After saying his goodbyes and cautioning Miguel to heed Kuruk's commands, Elijah gathered his things, double-checked that he had everything he would need, then used Shape of the Sky. The transformation came much more quickly, barely taking a second when, before, it had taken a couple. Soon enough, he'd launched himself toward the sky. He beat his powerful wings, rising above the grove as he quickly gained altitude. There was something undeniably addictive about flight, about defying gravity to soar through the air. Not only was it a much quicker means of travel than going on foot, but it represented a degree of freedom that few humans had ever enjoyed. In his flight form, he could go almost anywhere, do almost anything. And that was a heady notion, especially given the breadth of miracles waiting to be discovered. He'd seen a few such miracles since Earth had been touched by the World Tree. Some were large, like the presence of a skyscraper in the middle of an untouched and pristine valley. Or the deep ravine that rivaled or perhaps even exceeded the Grand Canyon in scope. But there were plenty of small miracles as well. The peaceful glades, the curious wildlife, the streams and waterfalls, the whole world was magical and miraculous, and though Elijah was wholeheartedly committed to his quest for vengeance, he couldn't deny that a good part of him desperately wanted to fly off toward the horizon on a different sort of quest, one of discovery. Elijah circled his island at an altitude of thousands of feet, and from that vantage, the entire landscape was laid out before him. He could see his island, small compared to the massive mainland. Ironshore looked tiny as well. A fairly well-contained collection of buildings that seemed far too small to house the few thousand people Elijah knew lived there. Then there were the looming mountains just beyond the town. The range stretched as far as Elijah could see, jutting much higher than his current altitude. At present, the peaks were wreathed in clouds and blanketed in white snow, making him feel even smaller than he really was. Elijah had become powerful. According to the power rankings, he was the strongest person on Earth. However, when he looked upon those mountains, he knew just how little that title counted. Before experiencing the touch of the World Tree and being transformed, Earth had seemed a lot smaller than it really was. Elijah blamed global communication, the ease of travel, and the internet for that perception. However, the moment all of that quit working, that view had shifted. Suddenly, a few hundred miles was a long way to travel, let alone thousands. Before, Elijah could have gone on the internet to see what was happening on the other side of the world. Now, he didn't even know what was going on in Ironshore unless he physically went there and asked around. And that wasn't even considering the world's transformation, which, according to everything he'd heard, was rumored to be as large as Saturn. Elijah had barely paid attention during lessons that covered astronomy, but he had some idea of the scope that size represented. The planet was at least 10 times its former size, and filled with wonders and dangers to match its new stature. Those thoughts flitted through Elijah's mind as he circled his island. Then, he turned his attention to the ocean. From so high up, he could see dozens of miles, and when he used Eyes of the Eagle, he could see much, much further. And under the effects of that augmentation, he could see darkness on the horizon. It was hundreds of miles away, he knew, but he could see enough to suspect that that smudge in the distance represented an enormous storm. Was it coming toward his island? Elijah couldn't know. However, despite the rain-soaked climate of his region, the island had never experienced hurricanes or the like. So he felt reasonably certain that they were safe from truly inclement weather. Besides, he also expected that the grove would survive any storm the world could throw its way. Sure, there would almost assuredly be damage. Maybe his coffee trees would be uprooted. But the ancestral tree would be fine. So would his and his sister's tree houses. For a while he continued to circle until, at last, he decided to get a move on. Initially, he'd intended to use roots of the world tree to instantly teleport to Seattle, but overnight, he'd decided against that tactic. The ability to immediately jump thousands of miles was too valuable to use it just to save a couple of days. The last thing he wanted was for the spell to be on cooldown when he needed it most, like if he needed a quick escape. Another part of the choice to forego the use of roots of the world tree was based on his burgeoning skill at flying. He hadn't used the form nearly enough for flight to feel instinctive, so he intended to use the trip to simultaneously work on his skills while also putting himself in the right mindset for the coming trials. Because Elijah didn't think getting revenge on Roman would be easy. Perhaps from a physical standpoint, he could manage it well enough. After all, he was the strongest person in the world, according to the power ladder. That had to mean something. On top of that, he had a wealth of combat experience, and in a wide variety of situations to draw upon. He'd recently killed one of the top 3 most powerful people in the world, too. So Elijah knew he had the ability to do what needed to be done. But killing someone in cold blood required a different frame of mind. That was especially true if he intended to bring down the city, too. Which was still up in the air, if he was honest with himself. On the one hand, from what Carmen had described, the entire city of Easton was rotten to the core, and the world would be a better place if that city no longer existed. However, on the other hand, Elijah knew that Carmen's perception was tainted by her own mindset. Inevitably, there were still innocent people in that city. And even if there weren't, there were degrees of guilt. Some people doubtless deserved execution. But others, even if they were in some way complicit in Alyssa's murder, hadn't earned that fate. It was a complex situation, and one Elijah intended to ponder as he flew toward the city in question. He beat his wings against the air, climbing ever higher until he passed through the clouds and into an entirely new world. Via one with nature, he could feel things he couldn't identify in and above the clouds. However, he saw nothing but a few shimmers in the air. It reminded him of what he thought of as the Predator effect, derived from the titular movie Alien, who could camouflage itself almost completely. However, when it moved, it created a barely visible shimmer. The same was true of the things Elijah sensed through one with nature. They represented a wide variety of shapes. There were things that felt like serpents, a few amorphous blobs, and humanoid variants, among many others. It took Elijah a few minutes to recognize that they were made of air, putting him in mind of spirits. Or elementals, perhaps. Fortunately, they were not aggressive. Indeed, they ignored him altogether, even when he came close. Still, it was an interesting discovery, and one Elijah would have studied closer if he didn't have his mission to worry about. As it was, he quickly left the clouds behind as he soared toward the mountains. As he drew closer, he recognized many other flying creatures. Some were recognizable species of birds, though they were typically much larger than they had been before Earth's transformation. Yet, there were other beasts that could only be described as magical in nature. Elijah saw a flock of winged serpents in the distance, as well as an animal that looked strikingly like a griffin, though he couldn't be sure, considering that it dove into the forested mountainside before he had a chance to study it. Eventually, Elijah found the path through the mountains. He didn't try to fly over them, instead targeting the paths he'd used before. As he flew through it, he saw that the remnants of the spiders had begun to fade. At last, the gossamer webs that had once coated the entire area had started to dissolve. There were other animals about, too, which boded well for the ecosystem's recovery from the invasive monster's presence. He covered ground much more quickly than he had in his first few trips, and after only a few hours, some of which he spent practicing flying through narrow valleys, he began his descent into the foothills. On a whim, Elijah decided to stop by Norcastle. Mostly, he wanted to check on Jess and Essex, but he also wanted to make certain that Ironshaw's interests were protected. After all, they were his allies, and their fate affected his own. The stronger they were, the better they would be able to protect their territory, which was a good thing for him. So long as they didn't get any ideas about invading his island, that is. But they'd stayed away so far, and Elijah could only hope that that pattern would continue. After a while, he saw Norcastle in the distance, so he landed badly and, after using Touch of Nature to heal the resulting injuries, he shifted into his draconid form and continued on to the tree line closest to the city. Once there, he settled down to study the situation. The city itself looked much the same as it always had. The gate was guarded, but not by either of the people Elijah remembered. That didn't mean anything, though. Perhaps it was just a different shift. Either way, Elijah couldn't tell much from afar, so he embraced guise of the unseen before padding across the large, open field until he reached the wall. Once there, he launched himself upward, using his claws to grab hold of the uneven stones so he could climb to the top. He reached his goal unseen, then crossed the 4-foot-wide wall walk before leaping down to the ground on the other side. And just like that, he was inside Nor Castle. After looking around a bit, Elijah could confirm that not much had really changed. Some of the people seemed to have higher levels, and the stench of corruption was gone. There also weren't any corpse wagons to be found, so he felt confident that the plague had not returned. That meant that Essex and his people, or perhaps the mayor's men, were doing their duty by periodically running the tower. Hopefully, the Reaver's citadel hadn't resulted in too many deaths, though Elijah expected that there would be a few, regardless of his efforts. He'd detailed the tower's layout, at least what he'd seen for Essex before leaving the first time, but even then, people would still have to do the work. And with the unforgiving nature of each tower's challenges, it was inevitable that some casualties would occur. Regardless, Elijah was satisfied that his efforts hadn't been wasted, so he moved on with the first task, which was to ensure that Essex was still around. A quick trip to the man's office told Elijah that he was fine, if a little overworked, but he didn't bother emerging from stealth. That would only cause the man problems. So he moved on to the next and more important task. The hospital was a lot less crowded this time around, so it didn't take Elijah long to find Jess. She looked much the same as always, wearing purple scrubs and a pair of sneakers, though she felt a little stronger than before. That was probably inevitable. After all, she gained experience through healing, which was her job. Elijah followed her for about an hour until she went to an office that would provide a bit of privacy. Once inside, he dropped shape of the predator and even as he resumed his human form, asked, "Miss me?" She gave a start, nearly falling out of her chair. Then, she patted her chest, saying, "Jesus, you scared the hell out of me, Elijah." "Sorry. I was trying to be spontaneous and romantic. By popping up out of nowhere. You have a weird idea of romance. Mostly derived from romantic comedies. So, yeah. You're probably right. But I was just kidding." "Sort of," he said. "I didn't leave under the best of circumstances, so I figured it wasn't a great idea to just come strolling in here. Hence the stealth." She let out a deep breath. "That was probably a good idea. There was someone looking for you a couple of months back," she said. "Big guy. Really strong. I don't think you want to let him find you." "Oh, him. I crushed his skull," Elijah said, picking up a knick-knack off the desk. It was a little bobblehead of a baseball player. But in my defense, he didn't give me much choice. He stabbed me in the heart. And in the back. A couple of times, if I remember right. Plus, he was all like, "I'm a mighty Viking hunter, and you are my prey. Rah." Or something like that. He wasn't a nice guy is what I'm saying. Had a nice water bottle, though. Really useful. "What?" Jess asked, clearly struggling to follow Elijah's interpretation of the fight. After only a second, she just shook her head and said, "You haven't changed." "More than it seems," Elijah said, his tone suddenly serious. "Probably not as much as I should, though." Indeed, most of the time, Elijah felt like the same person he'd been the last time he'd visited Nor Castle. But so much had changed that he knew that wasn't the case. Even his conversation with Jess felt forced, and not in his normal, nervous way. "Are you okay?" she asked, reaching out to touch his arm. Elijah shrugged. "I don't know, honestly," he admitted. "I found out my sister died. I haven't taken it well. It happened years ago. But I still feel guilty that I wasn't there for her. It's not your fault. Elijah gave her a small, sad smile. You don't know that. Neither do I. Chances are, I'd have ended up the same as her, even if I had been there. But the not knowing that's the worst, he said, shaking his head. I'm fine, though. I just thought I'd stop by to see if everything was okay here. After that, Jess explained that Essex had made a deal with the mayor to send joint teams into the tower. That had proven a success, and since then, the captain of the guard had worked to gradually gain more freedoms for the people. The mayor had acquiesced, especially when Keurig had appeared, and offered an ongoing trade deal. After that, his attitude had shifted, and the corruption that had been so prevalent the last time Elijah had visited had faded into the background. I mean, he's still a shady figure, but it's a lot better now, Jess stated. We all have full access to the branch too. So long as we pay a few copper Ethereum, we can use it as much as we want. That's great, Jess. I'm glad I didn't kill him last time, Elijah said. He'd considered it after the Mun had sent some thugs to his inn. Back then, he hadn't known if their intention was to simply collect him, rob him, or murder him, but he'd chosen to interpret it in the worst way. As such, the only reason he hadn't gone to teach the mayor a lesson was because Jess had asked him not to. Plus, back then, he'd maintained an aversion to kill humans. That still persisted to a certain extent, but if Elijah felt justified, he wouldn't hesitate. Either way, I'm glad you're okay. That's a load off my mind, he said. But I'm going to be on my way. You don't want to stick around? Maybe have a meal, she asked, hopeful. Elijah was tempted to take her up on it, but he shook his head and said no. Rain check, maybe. Then, he left the room, shifting into his draconid form the moment he entered the hall. Once he was out of sight, he once again adopted guise of the unseen before heading toward the wall. Elijah sat cross-legged on a boulder, his eyes closed and focused almost entirely on one with nature. During his previous attempts at cycling his Ethera in an effort to begin the process of advancing his core to the next stage, he had begun to feel something that he'd never felt before. Or rather, that he'd only experienced a single time, when he'd first tried his hand at cultivation and very nearly succumbed to what Nerthus had referred to as the call. Back then, the Sprigant had described it as giving himself completely to the mother. Or to nature itself. Though Elijah hadn't understood it at the time. Now he was beginning to. Because nature wasn't just some ephemeral concept. Certainly, it could be referred to in that way, but there was an underlying structure. Not an awareness per se, but a desire. A need. An influence that Elijah couldn't quite categorize or understand. But it was powerful, he knew, and he expected that it was partially responsible for some of his more questionable decisions. Like when he'd killed those hunters. Or when he'd nearly lost himself to his animalistic instincts during his first tower run. As he sat there, he traced that influence back to the very first time he'd laid eyes on Ironshore. Back then, he'd felt outraged at the deforestation and the billowing clouds of smoke that had come from the budding town. It wasn't until later that he'd moved away from that snap judgment and to something more reasonable. But he hadn't forgotten his initial anger. That he attributed to his connection to nature making itself known. It should have been obvious that his class would influence the way he saw the world. Or maybe it was his attunement. After all, nature was listed right there on his status. Regardless of the origin, Elijah felt that he couldn't truly progress until he understood the influences working to dictate his actions. In a few years, he didn't want to look back and realize that he'd begun to walk the path of some lunatic eco-terrorist. Nor did he want to lose his connection with something so powerful, largely because he felt it would prove necessary in the future. He didn't know how. Nor did he know why he believed it to be true. Yet, he did believe it, and that meant that he needed to understand what was going on. So he meditated, focusing his attention on one with nature. He felt every last detail of his surroundings, and for a 50-foot radius. When he truly concentrated on that deluge of information, Elijah felt overwhelmed by the sheer scope. Billions of microbes. Thousands of insects. A few animals. A host of vegetation. The list went on and on. However, beneath it all was what Elijah was looking for. There was an order to things. It felt cliché to think of it in such a way, but it felt like a circle of subsistence. An ongoing battle for survival that somehow fit perfectly together in a way where every individual organism got what it needed. Where did he fit into that? He felt simultaneously like an outsider, a part of the ecosystem, and a steward. A guardian of the delicate balance of life that was accepted, but never truly a part of that world. Unless he gave in. He felt the pull. The call. He could leave everything behind and join with nature. Like that, he wouldn't need to worry about things like vengeance. Instead, he would merely become part of the cycle, and when his time came, he would die, only to fuel someone else's survival. In that way, he would live on. It was beautiful. But it was also antithetical to everything it meant to be sapient. That subversion of the self was entirely unnatural, which was ironic, given that it would allow him to truly become one with nature. Elijah sighed, then opened his eyes to see a sun-dappled glen. He was a few hours away from Norcastle, where he'd stopped for the night. His morning cycling practice had somehow turned into a meditation on nature, but he didn't regret the loss of a few cycles of core cultivation. On the contrary, he felt that he'd made progress on a path he'd yet to truly recognize. Still, he'd already spent enough time idling in the dell. So he unfolded his legs and reached into his satchel, retrieving a hunk of dried meat. As he chewed on that, he hefted his endless canteen to wash it down. After breaking his fast, Elijah spent a few minutes stretching stiff muscles before using Shape of the Sky and taking to the skies. His takeoff was much better than it had been only a couple of days before, and he hoped his improvement would continue, at least until he could land without risk of breaking his bones. He flapped his wings, gaining a little altitude before speeding on his way. Elijah was tempted to stop by Argos, but he'd just left the city a few days before. So it wasn't that difficult to ignore that temptation. Instead, he flew toward the ravine, hoping to cut the swamp out of his journey. Yet, when he reached the area, he discovered that those large birds that were the frequent prey of the canyon spiders were quite territorial. They didn't appreciate his intrusion, and Elijah had no intention of fighting an aerial battle after all. His current form wasn't meant for fighting, so he reluctantly veered south. Soon after, he found himself flying over the swamp. Even at an altitude of a few hundred feet, the insects were maddening. But at least he didn't have to wade through tepid, waist-deep water. It took Elijah the rest of the day to reach the outer reaches of the swamp, but as night fell, he landed on one of the infrequent islands, where he spent a fitful night sleeping. He'd done the same during previous trips into the swamp, but that didn't mean it was any less nerve-wracking. Still, Elijah endured the rigors of swamp life for the span of a night, and the next morning, he left it entirely behind. If he kept his pace, he would reach Easton in only a few days. A week and a half, at most. No sooner had that thought entered his mind than he noticed a dark splotch on the horizon. At first, Elijah thought it was another storm, but if that was the case, it was even larger than the one off the coast of his island. As Elijah continued to fly north, the cloud resolved itself into thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of tiny shapes. It was only when he got much closer and used Eyes of the Eagle that he got a good look at the creatures, confirming that they weren't tiny at all. They were also nightmarish. With bodies that mostly resembled birds, they had all the requisite pieces. Wings. Feathers. Enormous talons that were larger even than Elijah's own. But instead of the expected raptor's head, they had the faces of women. However, they weren't ordinary women. Nor were they beautiful. They were, instead, horrifying mixtures of bird and woman that sent a shiver of unease coursing up Elijah's spine. Instantly, he knew these were no natural beasts. They weren't guardians, either. Rather, they were monsters, those unfortunate creatures that had been snatched up almost by accident and deposited in an unfamiliar world. They did not belong, and yet, though they were an affront to nature that Elijah was loath to let stand. But good sense won out over his outrage, and he recognized that he couldn't fight tens of thousands of migrating harpies. That mythological moniker was the only way Elijah could describe them, and it felt appropriate, even if it was more than a little unnerving. He dove, hoping to avoid the swarm. Yet, he'd gotten close enough that the monsters had seen him, so a few hundred of the creatures mirrored his move. He crashed down into the lowland forest, shifting into his draconid form before he hit the ground. That softened the blow, though the impact still rattled his teeth. But Elijah didn't have time to consider that, because the first of the harpies arrived only a few seconds later. And they were even more grotesque than he'd first thought, with huge, fleshy noses that resembled beaks. The first to attack was huge, at least as big as his predator form, which was the size of a tiger, and with a wingspan to match. It crashed into him before he could dodge, though he used flicker step before the momentum could take him more than a few inches. He disappeared, reappearing behind the monster, and after the single instant it took to reorient himself, Elijah pounced, using Venom Strike for good measure. Fortunately, the monster possessed no great defensive abilities, and Elijah's claws bit deep, ripping into its delicate wings with ease. The creature screeched in pain, the sound cutting through every facet of Elijah's mind and stunning him. He staggered, recovering after a second or two. However, by that point, it was too late. A dozen more harpies had arrived. And one of them had latched onto his back with its enormous talons. In only a moment, it was dragging him back into the sky. He shifted into his largest shape, transforming into a lamellar ape. The sudden influx of weight threw the harpy slightly off, which was enough for Elijah to latch onto the creature's talons, one in each hand, and wrench them apart. He put everything he had into the move, and it was more successful than he expected, going far past the point of pulling them apart, and into the territory of breaking the bones. Once again, Elijah was assailed by the monster's debilitating screeches, but that was only a minor concern, considering that he was falling directly into a mass of hungry harpies. With the instincts of the lamellar ape raging through him, Elijah let out a challenging roar as he fell. He hit with a thunderous impact that broke the unlucky harpy that was directly beneath him, but Elijah gave that monster's fate no thought. Instead, he lashed out with a backhanded blow that sent another harpy flying backward until it hit a nearby tree trunk. The sound of broken bones joined the cacophony of bird calls that had accompanied the flock of harpies. Elijah loped after it, leaping in to ensure that it was dead. As he did, he used his upgraded soul to fuel another transformation, this time back into his draconid shape. He hissed before clamping his jaws around the monster's body, crushing it even further. Though he didn't stick around to finish it. Instead, he raced along, dodging talons and, to his surprise, barbed tails, along the way. In his draconid form, he had the dexterity to manage the feat, though even then, he knew that the mass of harpies would eventually overwhelm him. So the goal wasn't to kill them. Rather, he only wanted to escape long enough to engage guys of the unseen. With that in mind, Elijah raced along, taking the hits he couldn't avoid. He could have easily endured them in the lamellar ape shape, but it was ill-suited for escape. Certainly, in that form, Elijah could move incredibly quickly, but if he tried that in the middle of a forest, he would have hit so many trees that any extra speed he could put on would have been completely negated. No, the draconid form was his best shot, even if it left his scales in tatters. Never was that clearer than when he sensed even more harpies hovering just overhead. Some descended through the trees, turning hundreds into thousands as the ferocious monsters continued to hunt him. Elijah ran, bounding over the terrain with well-practiced agility. It took almost an hour, during which he was further injured, before he managed to lose them for long enough to engage guys of the unseen. Still, even though he was cloaked in stealth, Elijah didn't slow down. Instead, he kept running for hours more until he stumbled upon an abandoned convenience store. Such buildings were not uncommon, but this one was mostly intact, so he hoped it would provide him shelter until the flock of harpies moved on. So he padded inside, and even though his wound screamed at him for attention, he took the time to ensure that no other creatures had claimed the location as their own den. Even with his natural affinity for animals, no creature would take an invasion of their home lightly. Thankfully, the building was empty, so Elijah found his way to a back office, where he finally shifted into his human form and saw to his wounds. They were extensive, with bits and pieces of his skin hanging off in ribbons. Blood coated his clothes, and half his scalp had been torn away. Even more distressingly, the moment he stopped moving, he let himself acknowledge the debilitating venom coursing through his veins. Those barbed tails hadn't simply been for show. Instead, they'd delivered one injection of venom after another. It wasn't as deadly as his own venom strike, and it didn't have anything on the afflictions delivered by Swarm. Yet, it was still enough to muddle his thoughts and make him cough up blood. Or maybe that was the result of numerous internal injuries. Regardless, Elijah quickly got to work healing, stacking healing rain, soothe, and multiple casts of Touch of Nature. He only got the first cycle out before his injuries, blood loss, and a debilitating venom among them took their toll. He didn't pass out, but he might as well have, for all he was able to move. Or think. Instead, he sank into a foggy, mostly paralyzed state where he could do nothing but wait for healing rain and soothe to counteract his conditions. Even as Elijah drifted in and out of semi-consciousness, his mind seemed determined to settle on his past and how it might affect his future. At times, he'd find himself daydreaming about growing up with Alyssa, and only minutes later, his thoughts would turn to what he intended to do to Roman. Back and forth, over and over, seeming to go on for an eternity. It was not a pleasant way to spend the couple of days it took him to recover from the Harpies' attacks, and their insidious venom that stubbornly resisted his efforts at curing himself. In the end, Elijah wasn't sure if he'd simply outlasted it or if he'd finally overwhelmed it. Either way, though, he returned to complete lucidity after a long 2 days, during which he used every ounce of Ethera in his core, and multiple times. By the time he regained his wits, Elijah knew well enough to recognize how lucky he'd gotten. Individually, the Harpies weren't terribly strong. He could kill them easily enough. However, when their flock numbered in the many tens of thousands, and with the potent venom they could inject, their lethality was nearly absolute. Few people would have managed to survive such an onslaught. Even 2 days later, Elijah could sense that they were still in the area. Every now and again, he would feel one of them swoop into range of one with nature. Fortunately, though, they seemed unwilling to land for more than a second or two. Southwest, his hiding place remained as viable as it had been when he'd found the abandoned convenience store. That meant that he didn't dare take to the skies for now. Still, he decided to take shelter in the old gas station for another day at least. As he did, he alternated his time between healing his wounds had proven extremely stubborn, so long as the venom remained in his system, and cycling his core. He still hadn't made much progress, but Elijah expected that his failure was due to the low Ethera density. After all, Nerthus had told him multiple times that even reaching the first stage of core cultivation was incredibly difficult, to the point that it would require outside assistance on Earth. And it would remain that way until the density of the planet's Ethera reached a certain point. It had definitely risen over the past couple of years, but Elijah expected that it still had a long way yet to go. However, he also had a bit of a secret weapon in the form of his grove, and more importantly, his cultivation cave. With the advantage that those spots' high Ethera density represented, he hoped to make some strides in core cultivation once he returned home. His stomach twisted at the thought. For some reason, it felt almost like a betrayal to think of anything other than avenging Alyssa's death. And it was even worse to make plans for the future, as if his current quest was just an item to be checked off a list. It was so much more than that, and rationally, he knew that fact, but his grief and guilt had no need for logic. So, it was with renewed focus that, 3 days after first taking shelter in the convenience store, Elijah shifted into his draconid form, then adopted guise of the unseen before leaving it behind. Sure enough, his suspicions about the Harpies proved correct, and the entire area was lousy with them. Most nested high in the tops of trees, but Elijah caught sight of a few as they swooped down to kill some unsuspecting beast. When they did, every harpy in the area would descend upon the slain animal, where the entire group would rip and tear the poor creature to shreds. Sometimes, the more volatile harpies would take things too far and attack one another, resulting in a bloodbath. Elijah kept a close eye on every monster he could sense, either with his mundane senses or via one with nature. He didn't think they could see through his abilities' camouflage, especially in the forest, but he also didn't want to take any chances, either. After all, he'd seen what those creatures could do to their chosen prey, and he wanted nothing to do with them. Or the nasty venom they could inflict upon him. With that in mind, Elijah padded through the forest, careful and hidden beneath the guise of the unseen. It was slow, but it was safe. Like that, he gradually covered ground. Miles melted before him until night began to fall, and he found shelter in an old, abandoned mobile home. There were a dozen more in the area, suggesting that the area had once been a trailer park, but most of the other structures had fallen before the rigors of time. After all, those sorts of homes had never been built to last. Still, the one where Elijah sheltered was mostly intact, though he did get a bit of a surprise when he found the previous owner's remains. The bones had been picked clean of any flesh, so only a skeleton was left. A woman, from what Elijah could tell from the pelvis. In the next room, he found a few much smaller skeletons. Children. Humanity had been hit hard by what many referred to as the apocalypse. Billions had died. But the hardest hit had been the children, who didn't even have the benefit of the system to ease the transition. All around them, creatures and monsters in human skin, like Roman, developed unnatural abilities, and they had no way to defend themselves. It was a miracle any had survived. Though there was some hope. Miguel had made it. So had plenty of children in Norcastle and Argos, more in the latter than the former, but there was no shortage of young people in either. Elijah felt some optimism at that thought. Even as he stared at the remains of the children who'd once called the trailer home, he could find some room for hope. Though it was tempered by reality. Humanity had suffered many losses, and Elijah suspected that more were to come. It was while he was clearing another of the rooms of any debris that a notification flashed before Elijah's mind's eye. For years have passed since your planet, Earth, felt the transformative touch of the World Tree. In 1 year, the top 5,000 humans and top 500 settlers will be afforded the opportunity to endure the trial of primacy. Participation is not mandatory, though it is encouraged. In one year, present yourself at any branch of the World Tree, and you will be teleported to the trial grounds. Prepare yourselves accordingly. The trial of primacy. Elijah muttered aloud. His voice was barely a whisper, largely because the harpies were still about. What the hell is that? But as always, there was no answer. The system seemed hell-bent on forcing everyone to consult the knowledge base for answers. When he went back to the elven city of Arvindor, he intended to use the librarian to get at least one answer. Maybe he would ask about the trial of primacy. More than that, though, Elijah was surprised that his estimate of time had been a little off. Until that point, he'd thought that they'd passed the 4-year mark months past. However, unless the system used some other calendar, he'd been mistaken. Still, 4 years was a long time, and it felt even longer than it really was. Simultaneously, though, it was like he'd washed ashore on the island only recently. Much had happened since then. He was an entirely different person, and not just because he'd beaten cancer that should have been terminal. Not only were his priorities completely different now, but he was also the most powerful person in the world. That came with responsibilities. Expectations. He sighed, shaking his head as he sat in the corner of the room. He leaned against the wall and tilted his head toward the half-rotted ceiling. He wasn't as strong as he seemed. Elijah knew that better than most. Despite having a head start on almost everyone in the world in the form of his cultivation, which was assuredly more advanced than almost anyone else's, he had struggled in his fight against Thor. Certainly, he'd won, and that was what ultimately mattered, but it had highlighted the issues he would face going forward. On paper, he was strong. But his archetype, which was a hybrid that took pieces from a bunch of different disciplines, was never meant to be a frontline combatant. Sure, his class helped. So did his cultivation. But it wasn't enough to let him stand toe-to-toe with true combatants of similar level. He could do wondrous things. As far as he knew, nobody else had the ability to teleport across thousands of miles. He could create his own equipment, at least to a certain extent, and he could grow some truly remarkable things in his gardens. Yet, those things didn't help in a fight. Not for the first time, Elijah thought back to Kanae's shock when she discovered that he was a druid. It was warranted, too. From the guide he'd recently read, the archetype was heavily implied to be a mostly non-combat class that focused on nurturing their growth. That wasn't Elijah's path, though. He liked fighting. He enjoyed exploration. And while he also liked tending to his grove, the reality was that he would go insane if that was the entire scope of his future. So he had no choice but to push ahead with his cultivation, and hopefully, when it came time to choose his specialization, he could further adapt his archetype to his purposes. After that, there was an evolution to anticipate too. Equipment would help as well. No, Elijah's path was clear. He needed to scratch and claw for every advantage he could find, lest he be held back by his archetype's non-combat nature. In the meantime, he would lean on his versatility as he continued to gain levels. With that in mind, he settled into rest as he ate a couple of grove berries. Without those little fruits, his recovery would have taken much longer, which just solidified another one of Elijah's advantages. Everything grown in his grove was infused with dense Ethera. As such, it often had special properties, like the restorative traits of his grove berries. Hopefully, his coffee would be even better. And he still intended to make another staff once he finished his quest. The dragon-touched staff was great. Better than he could have expected. Yet, it still didn't feel as natural as either of his other two staves had. His mind whirled with plans for the future as he rested, and eventually, he settled into sleep. Thankfully, his dreams were of the normal, nonsensical variety, so he ended up resting well before rising the next morning and continuing on his way. Gradually, he made his way across the landscape. He was tempted to take the same path he'd taken on his way to Seattle after all. He could swing by Arvindor to use his question, but ultimately, he chose not to do so. Largely, that decision was based on simple expedience. Easton was located to the northeast, while Seattle was almost due north. So it made sense to cut diagonally across the terrain, even if it meant exploring new territory. Eventually, Elijah's path took him by a ruined commercial park located on either side of a 3-mile stretch of interstate. The highway was packed with abandoned automobiles, most of which bore some degree of damage. Some looked like they'd been stripped for parts, but judging by the rust, that had occurred some time ago. There were no signs that the region was populated. As Elijah progressed along the highway, he saw a few car dealerships, then a couple of big box stores, the sort that sold everything in ridiculous bulk, like gallon jugs of mayonnaise. Elijah inspected a couple of those, but other than picking up a couple of computers, a few giant packages of underwear, and a dozen tubes of toothpaste. He knew the last would have already passed their expiration date, which meant that the paste inside would be a little less effective. However, Elijah was counting on the fact that the tubes were unopened to have extended their shelf life a bit. Besides, even then, it would be better than the charcoal he normally used to clean his teeth. He also grabbed a box full of toothbrushes. With Ethera and healing, he didn't think he needed to worry about cavities. However, those two factors did nothing for bad breath. Whatever the case, his scouring of the big box stores took half a day before he decided to move on. Even then, the harpies were still around, which meant that he would need to continue on foot. So that's what he did, shifting back into his draconid form, and using his stealth ability to remain undetected as he drew ever closer to Easton, where he would exact his revenge. AD. Report. A gentle rain fell, each drop flowing off Elijah's sleek scales as he leaped from one rock to the next. Beneath him, a river raged, spraying a mist into the air as the swift-moving water crashed into the boulders. Elijah had spent hours trying to find a crossing. The current was far too strong to safely swim across the wide river, and not for the first time, he cursed the harpies that prevented him from taking flight. Their numbers had begun to thin, but he couldn't help but liken them to a swarm of locusts. Except these particular pests were as large as a lion, and with a wingspan to match, rather than the size of a thumb. Regardless, so long as he was careful, they didn't pose much of a threat. That would change if he failed to use Guise of the Unseen, though, so he remained cloaked in his camouflaging skill. Still, despite the relative safety he enjoyed, Elijah couldn't help but lament the slow pace of travel. When he'd set out, he'd hoped to be in Easton in a couple of days. And that would have been a viable expectation, given the speed he could achieve with Shape of the Sky. However, traveling overland was much slower, especially when he had to do so under the effect of Guise of the Unseen. It didn't prevent him from running flat out, but moving that quickly would strain the ability, which would chance exposing him to the harpies. So, as frustrating as it was, Elijah exercised every ounce of his patience to maintain his pace. He leaped from the final boulder and to the riverbank, then left the river behind. Elijah wasn't certain if the river had originated with Earth, but he doubted it. The thing was half a mile wide, a size that wasn't usually conducive to such a rapid current, but he didn't know enough about rivers to say for certain if such a body of water had existed before Earth's transformation. What certainly hadn't existed back then were the creatures that called the river home. They could only be described as monsters, though for once, Elijah chose discretion rather than confrontation. Not only would a fight bring the harpies down on his head, but he also had no interest in letting himself get distracted by one side quest or another, as he had throughout his travels before discovering his sister's fate. With that in mind, he continued on, crossing a few other, smaller rivers along the way. He also saw a couple of settlements in various states of development. One had high walls and seemed well protected, while another was open to attack and was barely holding on. The residents of the latter looked like they could use Elijah's help, but as was the case with the river monsters, he chose to ignore them. Perhaps that made him selfish, but with every step closer to Easton, his mindset focused on the conflict to come. He refused to dilute that by getting sidetracked. Days passed until, at last, he left the harpies behind. Or put more accurately, they chose to continue on, launching themselves into the sky and flying off as one ridiculously huge flock. In the beginning, he'd estimated that they numbered in the tens of thousands, but after traveling beneath them for more than a week, Elijah amended that estimate to millions. One day that might prove to be an issue, especially for any settlements in their path. Fortunately, the harpies seemed willing to avoid the populated towns and villages Elijah had passed along the way, which engendered hope that harmony was possible. If not, then someone would have their hands full with dealing with the monsters. But not him. Not now. Elijah didn't immediately take to the skies. Instead, he remained with his feet planted firmly on the ground, though he did abandon Guise of the Unseen. After a day of traveling out in the open, he judged it safe and used Shape of the Sky, and once again, flew high above the landscape. From that vantage point, he saw the terrain far more clearly. It wasn't particularly mountainous, but it wasn't flat, either. More importantly, the area was absolutely littered with remnants of Earth's fallen civilization. He saw overgrown subdivisions, stores, and even a couple of complexes that looked like they'd once served as schools. He also saw people. Not a lot of them, but there were enough small groups out and about that Elijah expected he was getting close to a sizable population center. Still, it wasn't until he saw the tall wall brimming with Ethera that he realized that he'd arrived in Easton. Carmen had spent some time describing it, so he knew precisely what he was looking at. Still, Elijah didn't immediately head into the city. Instead, he circled for a couple of hours until he saw a familiar sight. He landed in the center of the street that cut through his sister's old neighborhood. The surrounding homes looked little different than any other place Elijah had visited. A few of the houses remained intact, but most had been subjected to catastrophic damage. That had been exacerbated by time and the weather, which had collapsed most of the structures. Elijah remembered the last time he'd visited. Back then, Miguel had only been 4 or 5 years old. Just about to start kindergarten. Carmen had been working on her dissertation, while Alyssa had just started her career as a police officer a couple of years before. For his part, Elijah had just gotten a job after finishing his doctorate, and he'd decided to visit his sister before starting. In those days, the apathy concerning his chosen field hadn't truly set in, and he'd been eager to do important research that he'd hoped would change the world. I was so naive, he muttered to himself, having shifted back to his human form. They all were. Alyssa thought she was going to help her community and change police practices for the better. She'd tried. For a while. But eventually, she'd come to realize that there was only so much a single police officer could do, and she'd shifted her focus toward the pursuit of a law degree. Carmen might have been the most realistic of them. She knew her chosen field wasn't particularly important, but she was no less enthusiastic for it. Who could have predicted that she would use those skills to become one of the strongest crafters in the world? Certainly not Elijah. For what felt like the 1000th time, Elijah wished he'd chosen to come back home sooner. If he'd taken a flight even a day earlier, he would have been in Easton when the world had transformed. But would that have helped? Without Nerthus' guidance in cultivating his body, the cancer would have remained. And he'd been close enough to death that there was almost no chance that he would have discovered the means to cure himself without the Spriggan's help. So as easy as it was to second-guess the past, Elijah knew that it wouldn't have mattered. There was nothing he could have done to prevent Alyssa's death. In fact, his presence would have been a hindrance. With that in mind, Elijah continued down the street, the iron cap on the butt of his staff clicking against the pavement. Most of the street was covered by a layer of dirt or vegetation, but there were still a few bare patches. There were animals all around, many of them having created nests inside the houses, but none of them bothered Elijah as he strode toward his sister's house. His path unimpeded, he reached the site only a few minutes later. The low-slung, single-story house was just as overgrown as all the rest, and half of it had been entirely destroyed. The other half remained strikingly intact, though, so Elijah hoped that his reasons for visiting the house would bear fruit. He stepped forward, and an audible flapping sound announced the sudden ascent of a giant bird that had nested atop the house. Flashing back to his ordeal with the harpies, Elijah immediately shifted into his lamellar ape form. His heart pounding, he wheeled around, ready to fight. However, the bird was just a normal, if overgrown, crow. It circled a couple of times, cawing loudly, but it clearly had no intention of picking a fight. His heart beating out of his chest, Elijah steadied himself before shifting back to his human form. The experience with the harpies had clearly taken their toll. It took a few moments for his heartbeat to normalize, and when it did, he continued forward. The door had been knocked from its hinges, and it lay to the side, half on the porch and the other half tangled in the overgrown topiary that hid most of the house's facade. Elijah stepped inside. The sun was still high in the sky, but the interior of the house was mired in darkness. As a result, it took a few moments for Elijah's eyesight to adjust to the gloom. While he waited, he focused on one with nature, cataloging the various organisms in the house. There were a few rodents, plenty of reptiles like lizards and snakes, and more insects than Elijah wanted to count. He did make note of a large colony of termites that reminded him of his experiences in the Magister's estate. But there was nothing inside that would threaten his life. So, when his eyes adjusted, Elijah set about his task without fear. The first place he visited was the kitchen, where he found a bunch of rusted pots and a host of empty cabinets. After the world's transformation, Easton's residents had survived in no small part due to extensive scavenging efforts. So the fact that the house had been picked clean of immediately useful things, which included the cabinet's contents, wasn't particularly surprising. Still, Elijah did find a huge cast iron pan that he thought would be useful. It was marred by a patina of rust, but he knew that wasn't enough to ruin such a sturdy pan. Not that he could use it for its intended purpose. After all, he didn't have a cooking skill, which meant that anything he prepared would be bland and tasteless. Maybe he could gift it to someone. Or perhaps his packrat tendencies were making themselves known. In any case, it didn't take him long to move on from his sister's kitchen. The next stop was the living room, where he'd hoped to find some photos. However, that hope was quickly dashed when he saw that anything that hadn't been taken was rotted, probably due to the area's humid climate. Still, Elijah spent a while sifting through the ruins, hoping to get lucky. He did not. And after some time, he moved on to what had to be Miguel's room. There he found much of the same. The bed had been stripped of its mattress, and the chest of drawers was entirely empty. The television remained, as well as an old gaming system. However, Elijah knew that neither would work, even if he managed to provide electricity. In its ruined state, the house offered minimal protection against the elements, which didn't mix well with electronics. Elijah did find a few shirts hanging in the closet, though they were far too small for the current Miguel. So, it wasn't long before he moved to the master bedroom, where he found more of the same. Decayed photos, inactive electronics, and rotted clothes. However, he did find a pistol in a case under the bed. Useless hunk of metal, he said aloud, tossing it back to the floor. The other discovery was in that same case, and for a long moment, Elijah stared at the wad of cash. He knew it was an emergency fund, intended for use if the electrical grid went offline and cards stopped working. A reasonable thing to have, but ultimately, it had proven entirely useless. What use was a few bills when monsters were trying to rip your face off? The rest of Elijah's search bore no fruit, so when he found the basement, he didn't have high hopes. He descended the steps, his shoulders slumping in both fatigue and frustration. Yet, that all disappeared when he laid eyes on an item in the corner.